My presentation, the one I hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night for over 3 weeks to finish, was currently being projected on the boardroom's 80-inch screen under a title slide that read, "Willow Albright presents the Meridian Initiative." I watched my own charts, my own color-coded projections, my own footnotes, click across the screen one slide at a time, while Willow stood at the podium in the blazer I'd helped her pick out, soaking in applause like a sponge left out in the rain. "This is exactly the kind of visionary thinking that's going to define this company's next decade," said Robert Albright, chairman, CEO, and Willow's father, beaming at his daughter like she'd just performed open-heart surgery instead of read someone else's slide deck out loud in a semi-competent tone. I sat in the third row of folding chairs reserved for interns, closest to the door, closest to the exit, closest to the emergency stairwell I was mentally calculating the distance to. Nobody in that room had once looked at me. I had built the entire supply chain optimization model from raw data myself, on my own laptop, on my own time, because my actual assigned work, filing, calendar management, coffee, left me nothing but the hours between midnight and 4 a.m. to prove I was capable of more than being Beatrice Vance's niece, the charity case intern nobody remembered hiring. The applause rolled on. Owen Beckett, VP of Strategic Growth, Willow's fiancé, golden retriever smile stapled to his face 24 hours a day, stood up first to lead the ovation, the way he always did whenever Willow needed one. He caught my eye for exactly half a second across the room. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't even acknowledgement. It was the flat, satisfied look of a man checking that the trash had, in fact, been taken out. "Clara did help me organize a few of the early drafts," Willow added at the very end, with the exact tone people use when they want credit for generosity they never actually extended. A few heads turned toward me. I smiled the way you smile when a dentist tells you this is going to be a little uncomfortable. Afterward, in the hallway, my direct supervisor, a mid-level nothing named Jocelyn, who existed solely to relay other people's decisions to people even lower than her, caught my elbow. "You should be thanking Willow," she said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "Not every intern gets mentioned by name in a board meeting. You should be smiling more. Gratitude is a good look on you." I smiled. Somewhere behind my ribs, something that had been holding itself together with duct tape and spite for 2 straight years, quietly, finally, gave out. It wasn't really about the Meridian Initiative, if I'm being honest with myself, and I've had 2 years since to be honest with myself about very little else. It was about the accumulation. 6 weeks earlier, Willow had asked me to stay late, just this once, to help her prep for an investor call, and then left at 6 to get her nails done, texting me the talking points from the salon while I sat alone in a conference room fielding questions from 3 increasingly annoyed board liaisons who kept asking, with growing impatience, where Ms. Whitfield actually was. 3 months before that, she'd borrowed $400 for a work emergency that turned out to be a birthday gift for Owen, and had, in the 18 months since, repaid exactly none of it, while somehow finding the money for a 2-week trip to the coast that she posted 11 photographs from. A year before that, on my birthday, the one day I'd mentioned to her, quietly, almost apologetically, that I didn't have any particular plans, she had scheduled an emergency team dinner that turned out to be a celebration for Owen's promotion, and had asked me, with a completely straight face, if I'd mind picking up the cake on my way in since I wasn't doing anything else that day anyway. None of it, on its own, would have broken anything. That was the entire design of it, I think, though I don't believe Willow was ever quite deliberate enough to call it a design. It was simply the reflexive, unexamined entitlement of someone who has never once had to consider that the people around her might be running on a finite supply of patience instead of an infinite one. Every individual incident was small enough to swallow. Every apology, when one came at all, was just sincere enough to make swallowing the next one feel obligatory. I had spent 2 years telling myself that staying quiet, staying agreeable, staying exactly as harmless and grateful as everyone in that building expected an unpaid intern with a borrowed last name to be, was simply the price of staying close enough to Whitfield Consolidated's records to find what Beatrice and I actually needed. I had not, until that exact moment in the stairwell, allowed myself to notice how much of myself I had spent paying it. I don't remember deciding to go into the stairwell instead of back to my desk. I just remember sitting down on the cold concrete step, my back against the railing, my mother's locket, the one piece of her I had left, a small, tarnished oval I never took off, pressed so hard into my palm that the edge of it left a red crescent in my skin. I remember thinking, with a kind of exhausted, clinical detachment, that I had spent my entire life being generous with people who would never once be generous back, and that maybe the problem wasn't them. Maybe the problem was that I kept letting it happen. The locket went hot. Not warm, hot, like a coal, like something alive. And then the hallway lights flickered, my ears popped like I'd dropped in an elevator, and I was standing at my desk again, 5 minutes and 40 seconds before Jocelyn told me to smile more, watching her walk toward me in the exact same navy cardigan, opening her mouth to say the exact same words. I want to be very clear about how insane that sounds, because it took me the better part of that first day to stop assuming I was having some kind of nervous breakdown brought on by sleep deprivation and quiet rage. But every word out of Jocelyn's mouth matched, syllable for syllable, the conversation I had already lived through 5 minutes in what I could only call the future. I knew what she was going to say before she said it. I knew, with the specific horror of prophecy, that she was about to tell me gratitude was a good look on me. So this time, before she could get there, I said, "Actually, I wanted to ask you something about the Q3 vendor contracts," and watched her entire rehearsed little speech collapse into confusion, because the universe, it turned out, could be redirected. Not erased, redirected. That was how I found out that once, exactly once, every single day, whenever I needed it most, I could pull 5 minutes back out of the jaws of a day that was trying to eat me alive. I didn't understand the mechanics of it for weeks. I still don't, not fully. What I do know, because I tested it obsessively, quietly, alone in my studio apartment with a stopwatch and a notebook, is this. It only works once between midnight and midnight. It only pulls back exactly 5 minutes, no more, no less. I keep every memory of the version that didn't happen, which means I am the only person alive who remembers conversations that, as far as the rest of the world is concerned, never took place. And it costs something, a thin trickle of blood from my nose, gone in seconds, and a headache that sits behind my left eye for the rest of the day like a tenant who won't leave. Small enough to hide behind a tissue and an aspirin. Large enough that I learned, fast, not to waste it. 5 minutes a day doesn't sound like much. It isn't much. You cannot rewind a merger. You cannot rewind a marriage, a funeral, a decade. But 5 minutes, spent with surgical precision, is more than enough time to change which folder gets opened in a meeting, which email gets forwarded a half second before it's deleted, which sentence gets said instead of swallowed. 5 minutes is a scalpel. I had spent my whole life being handed a butter knife and told to be grateful for it. I was done being grateful. My name, as far as Whitfield Consolidated's HR system is concerned, is Clara Vance. That's not a lie, exactly. It's my mother's maiden name, the one my godmother Beatrice legally buried me under 9 years ago, back when I was 15 and our house still smelled like smoke, and there were still men in dark cars parked outside our old street every night for a month, waiting to see if anyone had survived the fire that took my parents, along with everything my family had built. My real name is Clara Sterling. My father founded Callaway Dynamics from a rented garage and turned it, over 18 years, into the only serious rival Whitfield Consolidated had ever had in this city. And 10 years ago, in the space of about 6 catastrophic weeks, Callaway Dynamics was gutted, its patents stolen through a corrupted supplier contract, its board turned against my father through manufactured fraud allegations, its stock driven into the dirt by shorts nobody could ever quite trace back to a source, until the company that had taken my parents 14 years of 80-hour weeks to build was liquidated for scraps by men who smiled at the funeral. My father had a heart attack 3 days after the final board vote stripped him of everything. My mother followed him 11 months later, though officially it was pneumonia. Beatrice, who had been my mother's assistant for a decade and loved her like a sister, took me in, changed my name, and told me exactly one thing about the people who did it. We don't have proof yet, so we don't say a word, and we don't stop looking. Which is how, 9 years later, I ended up folding shirts in the mailroom of Whitfield Consolidated as an unpaid summer intern turned permanent unpaid nobody, 2 floors below the office of Robert Allwright, the man whose signature appears on the very first predatory loan document that started the collapse of my father's company. Beatrice got me in through an old contact, on the theory that if you want to know who burned your house down, sometimes the fastest way is to go stand quietly in their kitchen for a while and listen. The old contact was a woman named Anya Adebayo Shaw, who had once worked payroll for Callaway Dynamics back when it was still 3 trucks and a folding table, long before Beatrice ever joined the company, and who had left the industry entirely after the collapse to run a small non-profit placement service that quietly, unofficially, helped displaced workers and their families find footing wherever they landed next. Anya remembered my mother fondly enough that when Beatrice called her, 2 years before that presentation, and asked, without much explanation, whether she knew anyone with hiring influence inside Whitfield Consolidated's internship pipeline, Anya didn't ask a single follow-up question. She simply made 3 phone calls, mentioned a promising young candidate with a strong academic record and a quiet, hard-working disposition. And by the time I sat down for my actual interview with a mid-level HR coordinator who spent most of the 20 minutes checking her phone under the table, the position had already been informally decided in my favor before I ever opened my mouth. I remember being furious about that, in the specific, useless way you're furious about things you know are necessary but still resent. I want to earn it honestly, I told Beatrice, the week before my start date, sitting at the same kitchen table where all our real conversations happened. Not because someone called in a favor. You will earn it honestly, Beatrice said, not unkindly, but with the flat, unshakable certainty she reserved for things she'd already thought through completely. The favor gets you through the door. Nobody can call in a favor that makes you good enough to stay once you're inside it. And I have never once doubted that you'd be good enough. I called Anya because doors like this one are rarely opened for girls without connections, not because I doubted what you'd do with it once it opened. Those are 2 very different kinds of help, Clara, and I want you to learn to tell them apart, because you're going to need both kinds again someday, and you shouldn't waste your pride refusing the first one out of some misplaced idea that it cheapens the second. I thought about that conversation more than once over the following 2 years, usually on nights I came home exhausted from being invisible on purpose, and I understood it more completely, I think, the day Julian told me about his own father's machine shop, because it turns out the whole architecture of this story, mine, his, even in its own twisted way Owen's, was built on exactly the same question. Who gets a door open for them, and who has to build their own? And how much of what happens afterward actually depends on which kind of door it was. I hadn't found what I needed. Not yet. What I had found instead, entirely by accident, was Willow, Robert's only daughter, who decided in my first week that I was harmless enough to be useful and pathetic enough to be a friend. The way people adopt a stray they intend to feed exactly as much as makes them feel good about themselves, and not 1 crumb more. And Owen, her fiancé, who ran strategic growth with the specific charm of a man who has never once in his adult life been told no and taken it seriously. I had planned to stay invisible, watch, wait, build a case slowly, the way Beatrice and I had always planned to. And then Willow stood at a podium and read my supply chain model back to 200 people as if she'd built it in the shower that morning, and something in me that had been very carefully, very deliberately patient for 9 years decided patience was for people who could afford it. The next morning, I used my 5 minutes for the first time on purpose. Owen had a habit, I'd clocked it months ago without knowing what to do with it, of stopping by Jocelyn's desk every morning at 8:52 exactly to drop off a folder of notes that were, transparently, edits meant to make his numbers look better before they went upstairs. At 8:51, I watched him walk toward her desk with the folder under his arm, and I let it happen exactly as it always happened, right up until 8:56, when he turned and walked away, and Jocelyn slid the folder into her outbox unread, the way she always did, because reading things is a skill nobody at Whitfield Consolidated seemed to consider part of their job description. Then I reached for the locket, and the world hiccuped, and it was 8:51 again, Owen walking toward the desk with the same folder under his arm. This time, I was already standing at the printer 3 feet away when he arrived, close enough to see him slide a single loose page, not stapled with the rest, not part of the official packet, into the middle of the folder. A page that, when Jocelyn glanced away to answer her phone at exactly 8:53, the way she always did because the phone always rang at exactly 8:53, I lifted out with 2 fingers and photographed with my own phone before sliding it back in, untouched, unnoticed, gone. It was a revised vendor allocation sheet. Owen had been quietly rerouting 11% of Strategic Growth's discretionary supplier budget to a shell logistics firm registered 8 months ago to an address that, when I looked it up that night, turned out to be a storage unit in the industrial district. Not embezzlement exactly, not yet. A pipeline. Something being built slowly, patiently, the way you build a trapdoor before you actually need someone to fall through it. I didn't do anything with it that day. I just filed it. Photographed, dated, backed up in 3 places the way Beatrice had trained me to handle anything I ever found. Evidence doesn't help you if you use it too early. Evidence helps you when you have enough of it that nobody in the room can pretend it's a misunderstanding. I want to tell you I felt triumphant. Mostly I felt tired, and a little bit sick, the way you feel the first time you realize the floor of the building you work in is not, in fact, solid. Willow found me at lunch 2 days later, sliding into the seat across from me in the break room with the specific energy of someone who has already decided what the conversation is going to be about and doesn't need my participation to have it. Okay, so, don't be weird about this, she said, which is a sentence that has never once preceded something that didn't require me to be weird about it. But Daddy wants me to run point on the Q4 vendor renegotiation, and I was thinking since you did such a good job pulling those numbers together for the Meridian thing, that I built the entire model, I said before I could stop myself. Willow blinked at me like I'd started speaking in a language she'd never encountered, possibly because in the 2 years she'd known me, I had never once corrected her about anything. Not the coffee order, not the dry cleaning, not the small constant erosions of who did what. Her face did a complicated thing, surprise, then a flicker of something almost like fear, then a smoothing over into the practiced, slightly wounded expression she used whenever she wanted you to feel guilty for noticing what she'd just done. Wow, okay, I said you helped organize it. I don't know why you're being so sensitive about this. I thought we were friends. We were not friends. We had never been friends. Friends do not hand you their dry cleaning ticket and then post a photo of themselves doing self-care at the spa you dropped it off at. But I had spent 2 years letting her believe otherwise, because a friendly, harmless, grateful intern is invisible, and invisible was exactly what I needed to be while Beatrice and I built our case. I looked at her waiting, expectant face, doing the math on how much invisibility I actually had left to spend. I'll send you the model, I said, with my name in the file metadata, just so nobody's confused later about who to ask if something breaks. It wasn't a threat. It sounded almost helpful. Willow's smile flickered like a bad connection, and for the first time in 2 years, I watched her actually recalculate me. That night, I told Beatrice about the vendor sheet, sitting at her kitchen table the way I did every Thursday, the one ritual neither of us had ever missed, no matter what either of us was in the middle of. Beatrice was 61, silver-haired, built like she could still, if pressed, put a man twice her size through a window, and she listened to the entire thing without moving. The way she listened to everything, like she was filing it in a drawer in her mind that she would open again later with better tools. Owen Beckett, she said finally, very quietly, in the tone she used only for things that mattered. Sutton, as in Arthur Beckett's boy. I hadn't put it together. Arthur Beckett was a name I'd heard exactly twice in 9 years, both times from Beatrice, both times followed by a silence that told me not to ask more. She told me now. Arthur Beckett had been the private investment partner who structured the loan that first destabilized Callaway Dynamics, the loan with Robert Albright's signature on the guarantee, the loan that came with covenants designed, Beatrice had always suspected, to be violated on purpose so the whole thing could be called in at the worst possible moment. Arthur Beckett had died 6 years ago. His son Owen had inherited the seat on 3 boards, a trust fund, and, apparently, his father's specific talent for building things designed to collapse on someone else's signature. It's not proof, Beatrice said, not yet, but it's a thread. Pull it slowly, don't yank. I didn't tell her about the locket, not that night. I'd been carrying that particular secret for 3 weeks by then, still not sure if I trusted it, still half convinced I was going to wake up one morning and discover the whole thing had been some kind of stress-induced fugue state. But I went home that night, sat on my studio apartment's one good chair, and made myself a list. Actual pen, actual paper, the way Beatrice taught me, because digital files can be subpoenaed and notebooks can be burned. Of every single day, going forward, I intended to use those 5 minutes for something that mattered instead of wasting them proving to myself the power was real. Rule 1. Never use it for something small enough that I could just live with the outcome. Rule 2. Always know exactly what I wanted to change before I touch the locket, because the moment resets whether or not I'm ready for it. Rule 3. Assume someone, someday, was going to notice that I always seem to know things 5 minutes before I should. I broke Rule 3 within the month, and it very nearly cost me everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before that, though, I spent the better part of 2 weeks doing something that felt, in retrospect, deeply undignified for a woman who had just discovered she owned a small pocket of stolen time. I tested it. Obsessively. Like a kid with a new phone poking every single button before reading the manual. I rewound a coffee order to see if I could make the barista get it right the second time. I could. I rewound the exact moment I stubbed my toe on the same rusted radiator in my apartment 3 mornings running, just to confirm the injury genuinely hadn't happened in the new timeline, and cried a little from relief when it turned out physical pain apparently does not survive the trip backward. Only memory does. I rewound a text message to my landlord to see if changing 4 words would get me a different answer about the broken heater. And it did, which told me something important. The 5 minutes weren't magic in the fairy tale sense. They didn't bend anyone's will. They just gave me a second, sharper draft of a conversation everyone else was still living through for the first time. People didn't become different people. I just got to be a slightly better informed version of myself standing across from them. The nosebleeds were consistent, thin, brief, gone by the time I found a tissue if I was fast about it, and the headache always settled in the same spot behind my left eye, a dull, patient throb that lasted until I slept. I logged it all in a spiral notebook I kept in the drawer under my bed, the same drawer where Beatrice had once told me to keep anything I didn't want found in a casual search, back when casual searches of a 15-year-old's bedroom were a real and specific fear in our house. I told Beatrice on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the boardroom, at her kitchen table, over the same reheated lentil soup she'd been making every week since I was a teenager because it was cheap and it kept, and because, I think, some part of her liked that it never changed, even when everything else did. I hadn't planned to tell her. It just came out of me somewhere between the soup and the second cup of tea, in the flat, exhausted voice of someone who has been carrying something too heavy for too long and finally sets it down without ceremony. She didn't call me crazy. She didn't gasp. She set down her spoon very carefully, the way she set down anything she needed both hands free to think about, and she asked me one question. Does it hurt you in ways that don't heal? No, I said. Just the headache and the nosebleed. Both gone within the hour. She nodded slowly, and then she told me something I hadn't known in 9 years of living under her roof and calling her the closest thing to family I had left. That my mother's grandmother, back in a village outside a country neither Beatrice nor I could spell without checking, had been the kind of woman other women in that village walked 3 miles to consult before making any decision that mattered, and that the locket, the one thing that survived the fire along with me, the one I'd worn every day since without ever once asking why my mother had wanted me to have it specifically instead of the wedding ring or the earrings, had come down through 4 generations of women in my family, each of whom, Beatrice said carefully, watching my face for how much I could take, was known to have a particular kind of luck. Luck, I repeated. That's the word the family used, Beatrice said. I always assumed it was superstition. Grief does strange things to how families talk about the women they've lost. I'm telling you now because I think you deserve to know it isn't strange, or new, or only yours. Whatever this is, Clara, you come from a long line of women who found a way to bend a bad hand just slightly back in their own favor. Use it exactly like they did, carefully, rarely, and never, ever for something you could have gotten through patience alone. I have thought about that conversation more times than I can count in the 2 years since. Mostly on the days I was tempted to use my 5 minutes for something petty and small just because I could. Beatrice's version of luck, it turned out, was really just another word for leverage, applied by women who had learned, generation after generation, that the world would not simply hand them what they were owed. The next 6 weeks were, on paper, uneventful. I filed, I fetched coffee, I sat in the back row of meetings where my own work was periodically presented by other people as though it had fallen from the sky directly into their inboxes. What wasn't on paper was that I had started, carefully, patiently, using one 5-minute window almost every day to gather what I needed. I watched Owen redirect 2 more supplier contracts into shell companies. I watched Willow take a meeting with a headhunter from a rival firm, Halcyon Group, Whitfield's fiercest competitor in logistics tech, where she casually, stupidly, offered up 2 proprietary process details from the Meridian Initiative in exchange for what I can only assume she thought was going to be a job offer with her name already on the door. I watched Jocelyn shred documents she'd been explicitly told to archive. None of it, alone, was a bomb. Together, it was a house slowly filling with gas. I learned things about being invisible that I don't think I could have learned any other way. I learned that Robert Albright took his coffee with exactly 1 sugar on days the board was happy with him, and black on days it wasn't, which told me, better than any quarterly report could have, when to expect him to be receptive to anything at all. I learned that Owen checked his phone compulsively in the 90 seconds after any meeting that mentioned Halcyon Group by name, a tell so consistent I could have set a clock by it. I learned that Willow's assistant, a soft-spoken young man named Leo, who'd been hired the same month I had, kept a private list. I found it entirely by accident. One 5-minute window spent double-checking a filing cabinet I had no real reason to be near, of every deadline Willow had ever asked him to quietly cover for her on, dated and initialed. The exact same kind of unglamorous self-preservation Sylvia Caldwell would later admit to keeping against Edward Beckett. Leo and I never discussed it directly. We didn't need to. Some people recognize each other simply by the specific, careful way they've learned to survive somewhere they were never meant to be safe. I want to be honest about the toll of it, too, because I think it would be dishonest to make 6 weeks of quiet reconnaissance sound as clean as I've probably made it sound so far. There were nights I came home to my studio apartment, locked the door, and sat on the floor with my back against it for 20 minutes before I could make myself do anything else. Simply because the effort of being pleasant and small and grateful all day, every day, in a building full of people who would have discarded me without a second thought if they'd known who I actually was, cost more than the headaches ever did. Beatrice used to say that hiding is a muscle, and like any muscle, it gets both stronger and more exhausted the longer you use it without rest. I understood that sentence in my bones by the end of that October. And then there was Julian Croft. Voss showed up on a Tuesday, unannounced by anyone except an email from his assistant that had thrown the entire 40th floor into a barely disguised panic. Voss Capital held a silent minority position in Whitfield Consolidated, quiet enough that most junior staff didn't know his name, significant enough that Robert Albright personally cleared his afternoon and had the good conference room's temperature adjusted twice before Voss arrived, as though the man himself might complain about the air. He didn't look like what I expected. I'd built an image in my head, from the way people talked about him, of some slick, silver-tongued predator in a suit that cost more than my rent. What walked off the elevator instead was a man in his early 30s, dark hair, quiet eyes, dressed like he'd rather have been anywhere doing anything that involved fewer people, carrying his own coffee because apparently asking someone else to carry it for him had never once occurred to him. He said maybe 40 words in the 2 hours he was on our floor. Every single one of them landed like he'd already thought through everything you were about to say back to him and had simply decided it wasn't worth the time to hear it out loud. He noticed me exactly once, on his way back to the elevator, when I was crouched by the copier trying to clear a paper jam that had, ironically, eaten the last page of Owen's most recent shell company vendor sheet, the one I badly needed a clean copy of. Voss stopped. Didn't say anything for a second. Then he crouched down next to me without a word and pulled the jammed sheet free with the kind of practiced, unbothered efficiency of a man who has fixed 100 copiers in his life and never once considered it beneath him. "You're going to want to check the toner cartridge seat before you print that batch again," he said, handing me the sheet, not looking at what was on it, though I would have bet my last 5 minutes that he'd already read every line. It's misaligned. Skews page 4 every time. Then he stood, said nothing else, and walked to the elevator, and I stood there holding the 1 page of evidence I'd been trying to get clean for a week, absolutely certain, with no proof at all, just the specific, unshakable instinct Beatrice had spent 9 years training into me that Julian Croft had just told me, in the only language safe enough to use in an open office, that he already knew exactly what was on that page. I didn't chase it. Rule 2. Know what you want before you touch the locket. I didn't have a plan yet for Julian Croft. I just filed him, the way I filed everything, in the drawer marked later. I want to tell you about the first time I saw Robert Albright actually be good at his job, because up until that point, I had mostly cataloged him as an oblivious, comfortable man who mistook his daughter's theft for talent. And it would have been easier, in a way, to keep believing that about him for the whole story. It was a Tuesday in September, a routine vendor negotiation gone sideways, a mid-tier freight partner threatening to walk over a rate dispute in a conference room I'd been sent to for no reason except that someone needed to refill the water pitchers. Robert listened to 11 minutes of the other side's increasingly aggressive posturing without saying a single word, which I noted at the time, because most executives I'd observed by then filled every silence reflexively, as though quiet made them look weak instead of simply patient. Then, without raising his voice at all, he asked the freight partner's negotiator one question. Which of your board members personally approved the fuel surcharge clause you're now telling me was a mistake? And watched the entire aggressive posture across the table collapse in real time. Because the answer, it turned out, was nobody, which meant the whole threat had been a bluff, built on the assumption that nobody at Whitfield Consolidated would bother checking. He's sharper than people give him credit for, I told Beatrice that Thursday, turning the moment over out loud, half expecting her to dismiss it. She didn't. That's the dangerous kind, she said. The comfortable ones who are still sharp underneath it. He didn't stay blind about your father's loan for 9 years because he's stupid, Clara. He stayed blind because staying blind was easier, and nobody made him look. Don't mistake his comfort for incompetence. When you finally do make him look, he's going to see everything, clearly, all at once. And you need to be ready for what a genuinely intelligent man does with 9 years of guilt once it stops being avoidable. I didn't fully understand how right she was until the night of the board dinner, watching Robert dismantle Owen's story in 4 sentences flat, with the same unhurried, surgical patience he'd used on that freight negotiator a month earlier. Beatrice is rarely wrong about people. She has simply had considerably more practice than most of us at watching quietly from the edges of a room, cataloging exactly who is dangerous and in what specific way, long before anyone else in that room has bothered to look closely enough to notice. The first person at Whitfield Consolidated who ever looked at me like I was a whole human being instead of a piece of office furniture that occasionally fetched coffee was a junior analyst named Mira Rahman, who'd been hired 8 months before me into a role 2 pay grades above what interns usually got, and who therefore had absolutely nothing to gain from being kind to me, and did it anyway, which is how I knew, long before I trusted her with anything real, that she was probably safe to eventually trust with everything. She found me refilling the printer at 6:40 on a Tuesday, long after most of the floor had cleared out, and instead of walking past the way everyone else did, she leaned against the next desk over and said, without any preamble at all, "You know Willow is going to present your churn model as her own again on Friday, right? I heard her rehearsing it in the annex. She even kept your typo in slide 6. I remember being so startled that anyone had noticed the pattern out loud, let alone was willing to say it to my face, that I dropped an entire ream of paper on the floor. I didn't say anything because I figured you knew, Mira said, crouching down to help me gather it. But you had this look on your face just now like nobody had ever pointed it out before, and that's actually kind of sad, Clara. How long has this been going on? Long enough that I stopped counting, I said, which was as close to the truth as I was willing to get on a Tuesday with wet ink still drying on evidence I hadn't decided what to do with yet. Mira became, over the following months, the one person at that company who I let see slivers of the real shape of things, though never the locket, never the rewind, never Callaway. What she got instead was the version of the truth that fit inside a normal life, that I thought Willow was stealing my work, that I thought Owen was up to something with the vendor contracts, that I was quietly building a paper trail because nobody was going to hand me justice and I intended to build my own. It was enough. She started without me ever asking her to, CCing me on emails she had no reason to CC me on, forwarding meeting notes in case you wanted the raw numbers, casually establishing, in the unglamorous bureaucratic language of shared drives and meeting invites, a documented record that the actual analytical work at Whitfield Consolidated kept passing through my hands long before it reached a podium under someone else's name. Friday's presentation went exactly the way Mira predicted, right down to the typo in slide 6, which Willow read aloud without noticing it said, "the following projectiles," instead of "the following projections," and which got exactly the small ripple of confused laughter you'd expect from a room full of people too polite to say anything. I didn't need my 5 minutes for that one. Some humiliations arrive on their own schedule, and you just have to be patient enough to let them land. The financial piece came in November, and it is, I will admit, the one piece of this whole ugly stretch of my life that I still think about with something close to genuine, uncomplicated glee. Willow had, for about a year by then, been quietly steering Whitfield Consolidated's supplier budget toward a boutique packaging firm called Larkspur Sustainable Goods, which she talked about at every single meeting as though she personally invented the concept of biodegradable shipping material. It made for excellent optics. Robert loved being able to tell the board his daughter had spearheaded the company's green supply chain initiative. And it made for an even better cover, because Larkspur Sustainable Goods was, once I finally pulled its registration filings during one of my 5-minute windows spent parked at that same server closet workstation, owned in a controlling majority by a shell entity that traced, through 2 more shells and a paper trail deliberately tangled enough to discourage anyone from following it past the second layer, directly back to Owen. It wasn't corporate espionage. It was simpler and, in its way, more insulting. Willow had been unknowingly funneling company money into her own fiancé's pocket for a full year under the banner of saving the planet, paying nearly 40% above market rate for packaging materials that, when I had them independently tested through a contact of Beatrice's, turned out to biodegrade at roughly the same rate as a normal cardboard box left out in the rain. I did not report this to Robert Albright. Not yet. Rule 2 again. Know exactly what you want before you spend anything on getting it. And what I wanted, at that particular moment, was not simply for Larkspur to be exposed. I wanted Willow to be the one standing at the podium, in front of the full board, explaining it, live, in real time, with absolutely no 5 minutes of her own to take it back. So I waited for the quarterly sustainability review, the one meeting a year Willow had ever, in 2 years, seemed to genuinely enjoy attending, because it was the one meeting where the board applauded her for something she hadn't actually stolen from me. And I spent one careful 5-minute window, 3 days before the review, ensuring that an independent auditor's report on supplier cost efficiency, which had been sitting unread and unremarked upon in a compliance folder for 2 months, because nobody at Whitfield Consolidated read compliance folders unless legally forced to, got quietly, anonymously, forwarded to exactly the 3 board members who took quarterly cost efficiency numbers seriously enough to actually open an attachment before a meeting. I didn't write a word of that email. I didn't need to invent anything. I only needed the truth to arrive in front of the right eyes 5 minutes before the meeting Willow had scheduled to celebrate it, instead of 2 months later, buried under everything else nobody read. Willow stood at that podium and got exactly 4 slides into her presentation on Larkspur's environmental impact before one of the 3 board members, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Margaret Rossi, who had spent 30 years in manufacturing and did not, under any circumstances, enjoy being told a story that didn't match the numbers in front of her, raised her hand and asked, with the specific, devastating politeness of someone who already knows the answer, "Willow, can you walk us through why we're paying Larkspur nearly 40% above the market rate other vendors quoted for functionally identical packaging?" I was sitting in my usual folding chair by the door. I watched Willow's face do the thing faces do when the floor turns out not to be solid, the same thing mine had done in that same room 2 months earlier, and there was a small, ugly, satisfying part of me that thought, "Welcome to the club." She didn't have an answer. Owen, sitting 3 rows back, went very pale and very quiet, and I watched him realize in real time that whatever quiet cover story he'd built around Larkspur was about to get pulled apart in a room full of people whose entire job was noticing when numbers didn't add up. It didn't end Owen that day. It just cracked the first window open. But I remember walking out of that meeting with a headache I hadn't even needed the locket to earn, just from watching 2 years of quiet, patient work finally start paying interest. I want to tell you about the one time I almost used the locket for something I'm not proud of, because I think a story like this one is only honest if it admits the temptation existed, and existed strongly, more than once. It was the week after the sustainability review, and Willow had cornered me in the supply closet, an actual supply closet, which felt almost too on the nose even as it was happening, to deliver a version of an apology so thoroughly wrapped in self-pity that it barely qualified as one at all. "I just think it's really unfair that you'd let me walk into that meeting looking like an idiot," she said, arms crossed, genuinely aggrieved, as though I had personally engineered Larkspur's markup, rather than simply failed to warn her about a scheme her own fiancé had built behind her back. "You knew. You had to have known. Why would you let that happen to me?" I stood there in that closet, smelling of toner and industrial cleaner, and felt something ugly and satisfying rise up in my chest. A very specific, very human impulse. I could use tomorrow's 5 minutes on nothing more than watching her face when she found out, in slow motion, exactly how thoroughly she'd been used by the man she loved. Engineered so I got to see the precise moment her whole self-image cracked. I could replay it, savor it, the way you replay a song you love. "Rule 2, Beatrice's voice said in my head, unbidden, never for something you could have gotten through patience alone. And Rule 2, standing there, felt like the single most inconvenient sentence anyone had ever taught me. I didn't do it. I want to be honest that it wasn't some clean, immediate moral clarity that stopped me. It was mostly exhaustion, and a flicker of memory of Beatrice's face telling me about the women in my family who'd carried this same strange luck before me, none of whom, as far as she'd ever told me, had used it to make someone else's humiliation into a private pleasure. "I didn't let anything happen to you, Willow," I said instead out loud, in the actual present, no rewind at all. "Larkspur was Owen's arrangement. I found out about it the same way everyone else in that meeting did. I'm sorry it's ugly. I'm not sorry it's true." She didn't believe me, not fully, not that day. But I walked out of that closet having spent nothing, owing nothing, and having learned something about myself that mattered considerably more than any 5 minutes ever could have taught me. That the version of me who survives this story intact is the version who chooses, deliberately, over and over, not to let a stolen advantage curdle into something crueler than the original theft. Beatrice was right, as she almost always was. Some things really are better gotten through patience alone, even when patience costs you the sweetest possible version of the win. The suspicion, when it came from exactly the person I should have expected. Jocelyn, who was disorganized in almost every way that mattered, but who had, buried underneath the incompetence, a low, persistent instinct for noticing when things were happening around her that she didn't understand. She cornered me in the break room in early December, holding her coffee like a shield. "You knew about the Larkspur thing before Margaret said anything," she said. "Not a question. I watched your face. You weren't surprised. Everyone else in that room was surprised. You looked like you were watching a movie you'd already seen." "I read the compliance folder," I said, which was true, technically, in the loosest possible sense of the word technically. "Nobody reads the compliance folder," Jocelyn said, and for a second I saw something in her face that wasn't quite suspicion and wasn't quite fear, but sat somewhere uncomfortably between the two. "And the vendor login thing with Owen. You knew about that too before it happened. I heard Robert's assistant say you showed up at his office with the audit trail already pulled, before Jocelyn's phone even rang. How did you know to have that ready?" This was the moment I broke Rule 3, the one about assuming someone would eventually notice, because I hadn't actually prepared an answer for the specific, cornered version of this conversation. And what came out of my mouth was a half-formed excuse about IT tickets and standard monitoring protocols that even I didn't fully believe as I said it. Jocelyn didn't believe it either. I could see it in the small, careful way she nodded, filing the inconsistency away instead of accepting it. And I understood. Walking back to my desk with my heart going too fast, that I had just handed the single most dangerous person on that floor, not because she was clever, but because she was the kind of person who talked, constantly, to everyone, about everything, a loose thread with my name tied to the end of it. I used that day's 5 minutes fixing exactly that, rewinding the conversation from its start and giving her a clean, boring, entirely unmemorable answer about cross-referencing vendor reports during downtime, delivered with just enough mild irritation at being asked that she filed it under normal instead of under suspicious. It worked, but it taught me something I should have learned faster. The locket wasn't just a tool for winning arguments. It was a tool for managing exactly how much of myself I let anyone see, and I had gotten careless. I saw Julian Croft 3 more times before the frame-up, though I didn't understand until much later that all 3 were, in his own quiet, unhurried way, tests. The first was at a Whitfield charity gala in late November, the kind of end interns were technically invited to but never actually expected to attend because nobody budgeted for us to own anything appropriate to wear. I went anyway, in a dress Beatrice had altered from one of my mother's, dark green, older than me, the kind of quality that doesn't go out of fashion because it was never trying to chase fashion in the first place. I spent most of the evening near the coat check, doing the math on how soon I could leave without anyone noticing I'd come at all. Voss found me there instead of the other way around, which should have told me something, given that a man with his resources does not accidentally end up standing next to the coat check. You clean up considerably less invisibly than you do at a copier, he said, which I would later learn was, from him, something close to a compliment. I wasn't trying to be visible either place, I said. I know, that's the interesting part. He looked at me for a moment longer than professional courtesy strictly required, and then he said, apropos of absolutely nothing, your father used to wear a signet ring with a compass rose engraved on it. Cheap metal, not gold, because he refused to spend money on himself before he'd spent it on payroll. I only ever saw it in one photograph, at a supplier conference in 2011, 3 tables down from where I was standing as a 23-year-old nobody wanted to talk to. I didn't know his name yet. I just remembered the ring, and the fact that he was the only executive in the room who spent the entire dinner asking his engineers questions instead of talking over them. I didn't have anything to say to that. I still don't, not really, except that it was the first time in 9 years someone had described my father to me as something other than a cautionary tale about trusting the wrong partner. And I had to excuse myself to the ladies' room for 4 minutes to make sure I wasn't going to cry on a marble floor in a borrowed evening bag's worth of dignity. The second time was purely professional. 3 weeks later, a due diligence meeting Voss Capital requested on an unrelated logistics acquisition where I was pulled in at the last minute to run numbers because Mira has a scheduling conflict, and someone, for once, actually needed the analysis done correctly instead of done by whoever was standing closest to the podium. Voss asked me 4 questions over the course of 90 minutes, each one precisely targeted at the weakest assumption in my model, and each one, when I answered it properly instead of defensively, seemed to satisfy something in him that had nothing to do with the acquisition at all. You built in a 12% contingency on freight volatility that nobody asked you to include, he said afterward, alone in the elevator, the 2 of us and a security guard who was very studiously reading the ceiling. Most analysts pad the number the board wants to hear. You padded the number that protects the company if the board is wrong. That's not a skill you get from a training manual. My father used to say the safest number in any model is the one you'd still be comfortable with if you were the one who had to explain it to the people who lost their jobs when it was wrong, I said, and watched something settle in his face, quiet and certain, like a man confirming a hypothesis he'd already privately decided was true. The third time was a coffee shop conversation that wouldn't actually happen until after everything with Owen came apart. But I want you to understand, before I get there, that by the time that particular folder finally landed on that particular table, I already knew, on some level below language, that Julian Croft had spent the better part of a year quietly, patiently, deciding whether I was someone worth handing a company back to, in exactly the same careful, unhurried way I had spent 2 years deciding whether Whitfield Consolidated was worth staying inside of long enough to find what I needed. There is one more thing I need to tell you about before the frame-up, because it's the reason Owen and Willow moved when they did. with the specific, panicked timing of two people who had just watched something slip out of their control for the first time and didn't know any other way to grab it back. It was a Tuesday in late September, 6 weeks before the board dinner, when Whitfield Consolidated hosted its single largest client of the year, Corrigan Freight, a logistics conglomerate whose renewal contract represented by itself close to 9% of company revenue, for a dinner Robert Albright had personally overseen the planning of for 3 straight months. Willow was meant to run point on the presentation. The same presentation, as it happened, built on the churn model I'd finished for her the week before, and which she had rehearsed exactly twice, both times skimming past the section on regional distribution delays because, in her words, nobody actually cares about the boring logistics part, they care about the vision. Corrigan Freight's CFO, a blunt, unsentimental woman named Grace Adewale, who had built her career specifically by caring about the boring logistics part more than anyone else in any room she ever sat in, asked precisely the question Willow hadn't rehearsed an answer for. 40 minutes into a dinner that Robert had staked a significant piece of his own reputation on. Your regional delay projections for the Northeast Corridor assume a 15% buffer on weather disruption, Grace said, setting down her fork with the specific, unhurried precision of someone who has caught exactly one loose thread and intends to pull on it until the whole garment comes apart. Our internal data suggests that number should be closer to 22%, given last winter's disruptions. Can you walk me through where 15 came from? Willow's face did the thing faces do when a rehearsed script runs out 3 sentences before the scene actually ends. She looked, for one long, excruciating second, directly at me, sitting 2 seats down in the junior staff overflow chairs where I'd been placed to help with logistics, not presentation. And I watched her make a decision I don't think she'd ever consciously made before in her life. To actually, honestly, ask for help in front of a room instead of quietly stealing it beforehand and pretending she'd never needed it. I built that model, I said, before Robert's face could finish sliding toward the particular gray it goes when 9% of annual revenue is politely, publicly unraveling over dessert. The 15% figure accounts for the new rail partnership Whitfield signed in March, which should offset roughly 7 points of the weather-related delay you're seeing in the raw historical data, because it reroutes 40% of Northeast volume off the most disruption-prone corridor entirely. If you're modeling against last winter's numbers without adjusting for that partnership, you'd naturally land closer to 22. I can send over the adjusted regional breakdown tonight if that would help. Grace Adewale looked at me, really looked. The specific look of someone recalibrating who in a room actually deserves her attention, and said, "And who are you?" "Clara Vance," I said. "I built the model." "Well, Clara Vance," Grace said, glancing once, briefly, meaningfully at Willow, "I'd like you in the room for the contract renewal discussion tomorrow morning, if that can be arranged. I find I trust people who know their own numbers considerably more than people who've simply memorized a script written by someone else." She said it without any particular cruelty, which somehow made it land harder. The plain, unhurried honesty of a woman who had spent decades in rooms exactly like this one and had long since stopped bothering to soften observations that were, after all, simply true. Robert arranged for me to sit in on that contract renewal the next morning, over Willow's audible objections and Owen's considerably quieter, more calculating silence, and the deal closed at the original terms, with Corrigan Freight's legal team specifically requesting, in the closing memo, that the analyst who built the regional model be looped into future account reviews going forward. It was the first time in 2 years anyone at Whitfield Consolidated had put my actual name, even the false half of it, into an official company document as anything other than an intern who fetched coffee. And I understood, walking out of that meeting, that I had just done something considerably more dangerous to Owen and Willow than any amount of quiet, patient evidence gathering, because I had done it in front of a client too important to lie to, which meant Robert, for the first time, had a business reason to remember my name that had nothing to do with charity. Grace Adewale became, in her own brisk, unsentimental way, one of the most important allies I never asked for. She emailed me directly, twice over the following months, ostensibly about account details, though both emails ended with some variation of a single unsolicited piece of advice. The first told me simply, Learn to say your own name louder in rooms where people are trying to make you say it quieter. It gets easier with practice, and practice is the only thing that makes it easier. The second, sent the week after Corrigan Freight's contract officially renewed, said only, "I've been in enough boardrooms to recognize when someone is quietly building a case against people who think she's harmless. I don't know what you're building, Miss Hart, and I'm not asking. I just want you to know that when it's ready, Corrigan Freight will still be a client worth having on your side of whatever ledger you're settling." I never told her about Callaway, or the locket, or any of it, and she never asked again. But when the relaunch was finally announced, hers was the very first congratulatory note that arrived, unprompted, addressed correctly for the first time to Clara Sterling. She has remained, since then, one of Callaway Dynamics' most loyal clients, and she has also, without either of us ever formally naming the arrangement, become something close to what I imagine a mentor might have looked like if my own life had followed a less complicated shape. She calls twice a year, always brisk, always brief, always ending the same way. Learn your numbers cold, keep saying your own name, and call me if anyone ever tries to make you smaller than you actually are. I have never once needed to make that call. I suspect that's exactly the point of her making the offer in the first place. Owen tried something small and clumsy 3 days later, a minor thing in the scheme of what came after, but it taught me a great deal about how frightened he'd actually become. He forwarded me a set of vendor figures late on a Friday afternoon, CCing Jocelyn, with a note that read, in the studiously casual tone of a man building a paper trail, "Can you double-check these before Monday's board packet goes out? Want to make sure everything's accurate given the scrutiny lately." The figures, when I actually checked them that evening, contained a deliberately introduced error in the freight cost projections, small enough to look like an honest analyst's mistake, large enough that if it made it into the board packet under my sign-off, it would have been the first documented instance of Clara Vance providing inaccurate financial data to the board. A single loose thread that 6 weeks later might have made an accusation of leaking proprietary data considerably more believable to anyone inclined to doubt me. I sat with that email for a long time that evening, in my apartment, the same broken radiator ticking uselessly in the corner, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me, that this was the actual proof I'd been waiting for since the day I walked into that building. Not proof of Arthur Beckett's decade-old scheme, which Beatrice and I had suspected for years without evidence solid enough to act on, but proof, small and petty and personal, that the son had learned the father's exact method, down to the smallest detail. Bury the good, careful people under errors small enough to look accidental, timed precisely enough to matter only when it counted most. I understood, sitting there with a headache building behind my eye from nothing more than reading a spreadsheet too closely, that whatever came next was not going to be an isolated incident. It was going to be a pattern finally reaching its intended conclusion, one Owen Beckett had likely been building toward, in some form or another, since the very week I first badged into that building. I didn't need to use the locket to catch it. I'd simply learned by then to check everything twice. The specific, unglamorous vigilance Beatrice had spent 9 years training into me long before I ever needed a magic pendant to make use of it. I replied to Owen's email, CCing the same distribution list, noting the discrepancy in polite, procedural language, flagging a variance in line 14 versus the Q3 baseline, wanted to confirm before signing off, and watched, over the following 20 minutes, an increasingly frantic email exchange in which Owen claimed it must have been a formatting error on my end, and quietly, hastily corrected it before anyone else on the distribution list had opened the file, his tone shifting, message by message, from studiously casual to barely concealed panic, the specific, satisfying unraveling of a man watching a small, careful trap snap shut on his own hand instead of mine. It was a small, almost forgettable skirmish, but it told me with absolute clarity that Owen had started building a case against me weeks before the frame-up I eventually caught, that he'd been testing the water with something survivable before he moved to something career-ending, and that meant whatever came next was going to be bigger and better planned and timed to land when I had the least room to recover. I told Beatrice about it that Thursday at the kitchen table over the same lentil soup, and for the first time in the entire 2 years of this project, I watched real fear cross her face instead of the careful, controlled calculation she usually kept it locked behind. "He's escalating because something scared him," she said. "Men like Owen Beckett don't build a false paper trail against an intern unless they've started to suspect the intern isn't actually as harmless as she's been pretending to be. Something tipped him off. I need you to think very carefully about what that was." I thought about Corrigan Freight. I thought about Margaret Rossi's sharp, patient attention at the sustainability review. I thought, with a slow, cold understanding, about the due diligence meeting with Julian Croft 3 weeks earlier, where I had answered 4 increasingly pointed questions with a confidence no ordinary intern should have had, in a room Owen had access to the meeting minutes for, because strategic growth was CC'd on every due diligence session that touched logistics. "He thinks I'm a plant," I said slowly, understanding it even as I said it out loud for the first time. "He doesn't know about Callaway. He doesn't know about the locket, obviously. But he's noticed I'm too good at this to actually be who I'm pretending to be, and he's decided the safest assumption is that someone, a competitor, an activist investor, someone, placed me here deliberately to gather information. He's not trying to destroy an intern who's inconveniently competent. He's trying to preemptively destroy whoever he thinks sent me." Beatrice was quiet for a long moment, turning that over with the same careful attention she turned over everything. "That's worse," she finally said, "and also, in its own way, a gift. A man convinced he's defending himself against a corporate spy will move faster and sloppier and leave a much larger trail than a man simply trying to bury a rival. Let him be afraid, Clara. Fear makes careful men careless. It's the only reason Arthur Beckett's covenant trap ever worked in the first place. My sister and your father were too honest to imagine anyone would engineer a disaster on purpose, and by the time they understood what was actually happening, it was already too late to stop it. Don't make their mistake. Assume he's already planning something worse than you can currently imagine, and be ready for it before he moves." The weeks between that conversation and the frame-up itself were the closest thing to a rhythm I ever developed with the locket, and I think it's worth walking you through a handful of those days individually, because it's easy, telling this story after the fact, to make it sound like a single continuous campaign, when really, it was dozens of small, separate decisions, each one costing a nosebleed and a headache and a little more of whatever reserve of nerve I had left that week. One Monday, I spent my 5 minutes not on Owen or Willow at all, but on a supplier call I'd overheard Mira stressing about all weekend. A contract renewal with a regional carrier that hinged on a single line item neither she nor her manager had caught, buried in an addendum nobody had bothered to read past page 1. I rewound the 5 minutes before she walked into that call unprepared, slipped a note under her office door with the flagged clause circled in red, and watched her walk out of that meeting an hour later, looking like she'd aged backward 5 years from the sheer relief of not having gotten blindsided in front of a client. She never asked how I knew. I never told her. Some friendships work better when one person simply gets to be quietly, consistently useful without an explanation attached. One Wednesday I spent it on myself, which I want to admit felt almost shamefully indulgent at the time, even though nothing about it was remotely dramatic. I'd missed the last commuter train home by 90 seconds, standing on a freezing platform with a headache already building from a full day of pretending to be smaller than I was, and I rewound just far enough back to catch it, sat down in a warm train car instead of waiting 45 minutes in the cold, and cried, quietly, for exactly one stop, about nothing in particular and everything at once, the way you cry when you've been holding a shape too long and something finally, briefly, lets you put it down. One Friday, I used it to catch a printer error that would have sent an entire client-facing deck out with Whitfield's actual internal margin projections still visible in the speaker notes. An honest mistake, nobody's fault, the kind of thing that happens in every office everywhere, except that if it had gone out under my name as the analyst of record, it would have been one more entry in the quiet file Owen was building, one more thread for Carter Hayes to eventually pull on in a deposition room. I caught it with 40 seconds to spare before the email sent, and I remember standing at my desk afterward, hands shaking slightly, thinking with a kind of exhausted, grim humor that nobody warns you, when you discover you have a superpower, that most of what you'll actually use it for is administrative damage control. And one Tuesday, the Tuesday that mattered most, though I didn't understand its weight until much later, I used it on nothing more than a hallway conversation with Jocelyn, 3 days after the vendor sheet incident with the deliberately introduced error, in which she mentioned, offhand, refilling her coffee, that Owen had asked her that morning whether HR retained login history exports for longer than 90 days. I rewound those 5 minutes to ask a single follow-up question I hadn't thought to ask the first time, whether he'd asked about my login history specifically, or logins generally, and the answer, mine, specifically, mine alone, was the single most important 5 minutes I spent that entire autumn, because it told me, 3 weeks before the frame-up actually happened, exactly what kind of trap Owen intended to build, and gave me just enough lead time to already know where the server closet workstation was and how to reach it, on the single afternoon it would matter most. I was ready in the end, though not quite as ready as I would have liked, because 5 minutes a day, it turns out, buys you precision, not omniscience. And there is a version of the following month where I read the signs a little faster and never came within an inch of losing everything I'd spent 2 years building. That isn't the version that happened. What happened is the version where I nearly lost and clawed my way back from the very edge of it with borrowed time and a headache behind my left eye, which I have come to believe is a considerably more honest kind of victory than the version where nothing ever actually goes wrong. The frame-up came in October, on a Thursday, which is how I know for certain it wasn't an accident, because Willow and Owen had spent 2 months, I would later learn, timing it to land on a day Robert Albright had a board dinner scheduled for that same evening, the better to deliver my head on a platter with dessert. That morning had started like every other morning that autumn, which is precisely the kind of sentence you only ever get to write in hindsight, because in the moment, ordinary Thursdays never announce themselves as the last ordinary day of anything. I'd caught the early train, the one that actually ran on schedule, and spent the 22-minute ride reviewing a supplier variance report Mira had flagged the night before. I'd stopped at the same corner cart for the same coffee I always got, tipped the same extra $1 I always tipped, because the woman who ran it, Sophia, had once given me a free pastry on a morning I clearly hadn't slept, and I'd never once let myself forget a kindness that specific. I'd badged into the building at 9:28, same as always, and spent the first 2 hours of the day doing the small, unglamorous administrative tasks that made up 90% of what Whitfield Consolidated actually paid me, barely, to do. Nothing about that morning felt different. I want you to sit with that for a second because I think it's the truest thing I can tell you about how these moments actually arrive in a real life instead of a movie. They don't announce themselves with a change in the weather or a portentous piece of music. They arrive at 4:47 in the afternoon, in the middle of an entirely unremarkable Thursday, while you're refilling a stapler, and the entire shape of your life quietly, invisibly, rearranges itself before you've even finished the sentence you were thinking. Robert Albright, I should say, was not a man I ever underestimated, whatever else I've told you about him. And it matters that you understand that before I tell you what happened that evening, because a lesser man, a genuinely stupid one, the kind Willow and Owen seem to have quietly convinced themselves he was, easy enough to manage with the right blazer and the right timing, would have made the frame-up considerably easier to execute. Robert had built Whitfield Consolidated from his own father's modest freight business into a genuine industry power over 3 decades. And whatever comfortable blindness he'd allowed himself regarding Arthur Beckett's original loan, he had not gotten there by being careless with facts once they were placed directly in front of him. That was, in the end, exactly what made him dangerous to Owen the moment the audit trail hit his desk, and exactly what made him, eventually, someone I could work with instead of simply someone I needed to outmaneuver. It started with an email, not to me, about me, forwarded, apparently accidentally, into a shared drive folder I had access to only because Jocelyn was too disorganized to keep her permissions straight. The email from Owen to Willow, subject line, handled, read, "Sent the Meridian model specs to Reyes at Halcyon this morning under Hart's login. IT logs will show her credentials, not mine. Should be enough for HR to walk her out by Friday. Don't feel bad, she was never going to last here anyway." I read it standing at my desk at 4:47 in the afternoon, and for about 6 seconds, the entire office tilted sideways. They weren't just stealing my work anymore, they were about to frame me for corporate espionage, using my own login credentials, timed to land the day before a board dinner, so that by the time anyone thought to ask a real question, I would already be escorted out of the building by security with a box of my desk plants under one arm and a termination letter in the other, and Owen's actual leak, the one he'd been quietly running to Halcyon for weeks, the one that traced back to his real login, would be buried under my ruined reputation. I had exactly one 5-minute window left that day, and it was 4:47, and whatever had already been sent had already been sent. Rewinding 5 minutes from 4:47 wouldn't undo an email that had gone out that morning. This is the part where I have to tell you something about the locket that I didn't fully understand until that exact moment, sitting frozen at my desk with my whole future compressed into a single email thread. The 5 minutes aren't attached to the clock. They're attached to me. Whatever 5 minutes I am standing inside of when I reach for it, 5 minutes ago, or 5 minutes from wherever I choose to be, that's the only rule. I didn't need to undo the email. I needed 5 minutes with IT before HR opened that ticket. So I did the thing I'd never done before. I walked very calmly past Jocelyn's desk into the small server closet on our floor where IT kept a workstation nobody used because the ergonomic chair had a broken wheel, and I sat down, and I pulled up the login audit trail myself, using access Beatrice had quietly arranged for me 8 months earlier through a contact in IT security who owed her a favor old enough that neither of them had ever explained it to me. And there it was, a login timestamp from that morning, 9:14 a.m., under my credentials, originating from an IP address inside the building, but not from my desk. From a workstation on the 4th floor, Owen's floor. 14 minutes before I had, provably, badged into the building at 9:28, a fact the security system logged automatically and which I had never once had a reason to think about until exactly this moment. I didn't need the 5 minutes yet. I needed them for what came next. At 5:58 that evening, Jocelyn's phone rang. I was standing 3 feet away, refilling the printer when she picked it up, listened for 11 seconds, and said, in the flat, obedient voice of someone reading from a script somebody else wrote, "Yes, Mr. Sutton, I'll pull her badge access now." I reached for the locket. The world hiccuped. It was 5:53 again, Jocelyn's phone about to ring in 5 minutes, and this time I was not refilling the printer. I was standing directly in front of Robert Albright's office door because I had spent my last 4 days quietly, carefully, learning his actual schedule instead of the one his assistant published, and I knew, the way you know things when you've spent 5 minutes at a time, day after day, mapping a building like a chessboard, that at 5:53 on a Thursday, Robert Albright was alone in his office for exactly 6 minutes before his driver arrived, reviewing the seating chart for that night's board dinner, the one document I knew for a fact he actually read himself. I knocked. He looked up, mildly annoyed, the way he always looked at interns who had the audacity to exist in his line of sight. "Sir?" "Before Jocelyn's phone rings in the next few minutes, I need 30 seconds, and then you can decide whether the rest of tonight goes the way Owen Beckett has planned it, or the way it actually should." I have never in my life said anything that landed with more weight than that sentence did, mostly because I said it holding out my phone, screen already open to the login audit trail, timestamp, IP address, floor, all of it, next to the forwarded email with Owen's own words sitting there in 12-point font. IT logs will show her credentials, not mine. Robert Albright is many things, most of them things I have spent years learning to despise, with the patience of a woman waiting for a slow-moving glacier to finally crush something. But he is not, whatever else he is, stupid, and he is not a man who enjoys discovering he has been managed. He read the email twice. He looked at the audit trail, and then, at 5:58 exactly, his phone rang, and I watched him pick it up before Jocelyn's call could even connect, and say, in a voice I had genuinely never heard him use, quiet and very, very cold, "Get Owen Beckett in my office. Now. And don't touch anyone's badge access until I say so." My nose was bleeding by the time I got back to my desk. Just a thin line, gone in under a minute with a tissue, the headache already setting in behind my left eye like an old friend arriving right on schedule. Nobody noticed. Nobody ever notices interns closely enough to catch the cost of anything. I would love to tell you Owen confessed on the spot, dramatically, weeping. He did not. He did the thing men like Owen always do, which is to look genuinely, righteously wounded, as though the accusation itself was the crime being committed. Sir, I don't know what she's shown you, but this is clearly a fabrication. She's had access to shared drives she shouldn't. The login originated from your floor, Owen, 14 minutes before Miss Hart's badge cleared the building's front entrance, Robert said. And I watched something in Owen's face do the thing faces do when a story you've told yourself for years suddenly has a very specific, very unglamorous hole punched through it. I've asked IT to pull the full trail. Not the summary, the full trail. Going back 6 months. Owen's eyes flicked to me, and for 1/2 second, standing there in the doorway of a CEO's office at 6 in the evening, with a headache blooming behind my eye and dried blood on a tissue balled in my fist, I watched him understand, really understand, that he had made the single worst mistake of his career, which was assuming the quiet intern who'd spent 2 years fetching his coffee had never once, in all that time, been paying attention. Robert did not, as I half expected, quietly bury it and deal with it in private the next morning. To his credit, and I say this as someone who has very little credit left to extend him, he decided, standing there with the login trail still glowing on my phone screen, that if Owen had planned to destroy someone in front of an audience, he could answer for it in front of one too. "You're coming to dinner," he told Owen, in a voice that had gone somewhere past anger into something colder and more procedural. "So is she." He nodded at me without quite looking at me, the particular non-look of a man who has just realized he has spent 2 years failing to see someone standing directly in front of him. "Don't change out of that blazer, Owen. I want the board to see exactly the man who was standing in my office an hour ago." I want to tell you I felt triumphant walking into that private dining room 40 minutes later in the same clothes I'd worn to refill a printer, standing at the edge of a room full of people in cocktail attire who had never once learned my name. Mostly, I felt like I might be sick, and I spent the first 10 minutes of that dinner doing math on how many of my remaining 5 minutes I might need before dessert, before remembering, with the specific dread of someone who has just used their only chance for the day, that I had already spent it getting into that room in the first place. Whatever happened next happened once, in real time, with no second draft. Robert waited until the second course had been cleared before he stood, tapped his glass twice, and said, in the flat, unhurried tone of a man who has decided the evening's real agenda item is about to begin. "Before we get to the quarterly numbers, I'd like to address something that came to my attention an hour ago, because I think everyone at this table deserves to hear it before it becomes a rumor instead of a fact." Willow, 3 seats down, went very still. Owen, across the table, set down his fork with the careful precision of a man trying not to look like his hands have started shaking. "An hour ago," Robert said, "I was shown evidence that a member of this company's leadership team attempted to fabricate a corporate espionage case against a junior employee using her login credentials without her knowledge in order to conceal his own unauthorized data transfers to a competitor. I have the login audit trail. I have his email instructing my daughter on how the cover story should be handled. I'd like him to explain it to this table himself, since he clearly had a plan for how tonight was going to go." You could have heard a napkin drop. Margaret Rossi, 3 seats to Robert's left, set down her wine glass with the specific, unhurried motion of a woman settling in to watch something she intends to remember accurately. Beside her, board member Stephen Price, 71 years old, notoriously hard of hearing, and famous across 3 decades of Whitfield board meetings for interrupting important discussions to ask someone to repeat themselves, leaned toward his neighbor and said, in a whisper considerably louder than he seemed to realize, "Wait, whose login was it again?" Which somehow did more to puncture the tension in that room than anything else compared. Because 3 separate people had to quietly, urgently explain the entire scandal to him in the middle of Robert's speech while trying not to look like they were doing it. 2 seats down, a younger board member named Vivian Chen, who had joined the board 18 months earlier, specifically on a mandate to modernize the company's internal ethics protocols, and who had spent every quarterly meeting since, quietly, visibly frustrated by how little anyone else seemed to care about the protocols she'd been hired to enforce, sat up very straight, pulled out a small notebook, and began writing, with the specific, barely contained energy of someone who has finally, after 18 months of being politely ignored, been handed the exact scandal her entire job existed to catch. Vivian Chen used that notebook, and the momentum of that single evening, to push through a full overhaul of Whitfield Consolidated's internal compliance reporting structure within the year, a change she'd been quietly, fruitlessly proposing since the day she joined the board, and which suddenly, in the aftermath of Owen's very public unraveling, found unanimous support from a room that had spent 18 months politely tabling it. Margaret Rossi retired 2 years later on her own terms, at a dinner where she pulled me aside near the end of the evening and said, with the same flat, unhurried precision she'd used to corner Owen, "I've spent 30 years in rooms full of men who assumed competence and volume were the same quality. It was considerably more satisfying than I expected, watching you prove otherwise without ever once raising your voice." I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count in the 2 years since, usually on days I need reminding that quiet and powerless were never actually the same thing either. Owen tried, God help him, he actually tried, launching into the same wounded, righteous cadence he'd used in Robert's office an hour earlier, about fabrication, about interns overstepping, about how convenient it was that accusations always seemed to land on him lately, and he might even have half sold it to a room that wanted very badly to believe its golden boy VP was still golden, if Margaret Rossi hadn't leaned forward, folded her hands, and asked the one question that ended it. "Owen, sweetheart, can you tell us which floor your office is on?" "Fourth," he said before he could stop himself, before he understood what she was doing. "And whose login generated the unauthorized transfer again? Miss Hart's, I believe Robert said?" Margaret's voice never rose above conversational. That was the terrifying part of her, I would learn later. Watching her operate over the following months, she never needed volume, because she'd spent 30 years learning that precision does more damage than anger ever could. So perhaps you can explain to the table how Miss Hart's credentials generated a login from the 4th floor, 14 minutes before her badge cleared the building's front door that morning. Unless you're telling us she can walk through walls. Nobody laughed. It wasn't the kind of silence that has room for laughing in it. Willow's hand found Owen's under the table, I noticed, in the particular reflexive way you reach for someone before your brain has caught up to whether you still want to. And I watched Owen, very slowly, pull his hand away from hers, which told me everything I needed to know about exactly how much loyalty had ever actually run between the two of them once the cameras, figurative or otherwise, stopped pointing his way. He was placed on administrative leave before the plates were cleared. 2 members of Whitfield's internal security team, who had clearly been briefed and positioned outside the private dining room during the second course, in a level of preparation that told me Robert had believed the audit trail the moment he saw it, walked him out through the kitchen entrance rather than the main lobby, which I understood even then wasn't mercy. It was optics. Robert Albright had learned exactly one lesson that night, and it was that public humiliations were a resource, to be deployed or withheld depending on who benefited from the audience. I didn't drive myself home that night. Beatrice came and got me, having received a single text from me in the ladies' room before dessert that read only, "It's happening, come to the Belmont," and having apparently dropped an entire evening's plans without a single follow-up question, the way she always did whenever I actually needed her. She was parked outside within 40 minutes, engine running, and she didn't ask me a single thing until we were 3 blocks away from the restaurant, the lights of the private dining room shrinking in the side mirror. "Tell me everything," she said then. And I did. The whole thing, start to finish, my voice shaking in a way I hadn't let it shake in front of anyone inside that building, and Beatrice listened without interrupting once, both hands steady on the wheel, until I got to the part about Margaret Rossi's flat, devastating question about which floor Owen's office was on. "That's my girl," Beatrice said quietly, and it was the first time in 9 years I had ever heard her voice actually break, just slightly, just once, before she got it back under control. "That's exactly how your mother used to corner people. One question, no raised voice. Just enough rope." We didn't go home right away. Beatrice pulled into the parking lot of an all-night diner we used to go to when I was younger, back before either of us could really afford anything else. And we sat in a cracked vinyl booth at 11 at night, eating French fries neither of us had any appetite for. Not talking about the case at all anymore, just talking. The way you talk after something enormous has finally cracked open. About nothing in particular. A movie Beatrice wanted to see, whether I should finally get my headlight replaced, whether the diner still made the same milkshake it used to. It wasn't until we were back in the car, pulling out of the lot, that Beatrice said the thing I think she'd been holding the entire drive. "Your father would be so unbearably proud of you tonight that none of us would be able to stand him," she said, eyes on the road, voice perfectly even again. "I need you to know that. Whatever happens from here, however long the rest of this takes, that part is already true, and it was true the second you walked into that dining room and didn't flinch." I didn't say anything back. I didn't need to. Some sentences are complete enough on their own that adding to them would only take something away. I didn't get my full vindication that night. These things never move as fast as you want them to, and Beatrice had trained that patience into me the same way she'd trained everything else. What I got, over the following 6 weeks, was better, because it was real, and it was thorough, and every single piece of it had my fingerprints nowhere on it. Full IT trail pulled. 6 months of Owen Beckett logging into shared systems from unauthorized workstations, funneling proprietary process data to a Halcyon group contact named Reyes, the same headhunter, it turned out, who'd taken Willow's careless little meeting, meaning Willow had unknowingly walked her own fiancé's entire operation directly into a conversation that got recorded on Halcyon's compliance line. Because Halcyon, like every serious firm, recorded external candidate interviews for legal protection. And Voss Capital, as it turned out, held a passive information-sharing agreement with Halcyon's board through an entirely unrelated joint venture nobody at Whitfield Consolidated had ever bothered to check. I want to be honest, I didn't engineer that particular domino. Julian Croft did, quietly, quickly, quietly enough that I only understood the shape of it 3 weeks later when his assistant called mine, my temporary, brand-new, real assistant, because by then things had changed considerably, to schedule what she called a courtesy conversation at Mr. Voss's convenience regarding an internal audit matter of mutual interest. He met me in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the office, not his conference room, not mine, a small, unglamorous place with bad lighting and good coffee that I would later learn he'd been coming to since before he had enough money to need better options. He didn't waste time. "Your father built a scheduling algorithm in 2009 that Callaway Dynamics never patented, because the filing fee that quarter would have meant missing payroll," he said before I'd even sat down. "I know because I bought the original prototype off a liquidation auction 8 years ago for $400, back when I was 24 and had exactly enough money to be sentimental about one thing. I've been buying up scattered Callaway IP and dead patent shells ever since, slowly, quietly, on the theory that someone from that family might eventually want them back, assuming anyone was left to want them. I sat down very carefully, the way you sit down when the floor has just, for the second time in 2 months, turned out not to be solid. "You knew," I said, "this whole time." "I suspected, the day you fixed a copier jam faster than 3 of Whitfield's IT staff, and then didn't tell anyone you'd done it," he said, and for the first time I saw something that might, in a better lit room, have been the beginning of a smile. "I confirmed it the week you started pulling login audit trails through a back channel that only one person at Whitfield Consolidated has ever used before, and she happens to be someone I've done business with under a different name for 6 years. Beatrice doesn't loop many people in. If she looped you in, I wanted to know why. So you've been sitting on Callaway IP for 8 years waiting for what, exactly?" "For someone to walk back into a room and take it," he said, and slid a folder across the table, thin, unremarkable, the kind of folder that could hold a launch order or the deed to a company. "I'm not in the business of handing things to people who haven't earned the right to hold them. You earned it about 6 weeks ago in a stairwell, though I imagine you don't know I know about that part yet either." I did not in fact know that, and I have still, to this day, never asked him exactly how he knew about the stairwell, because some mysteries are more useful left as leverage than solved as curiosity. It took me a full week after that coffee shop conversation to understand that Julian Croft's 3 well-documented lunches with board members had not, in fact, been coincidental at all, but had been laid down with the same patient, unhurried precision he seemed to apply to everything months before Owen ever forwarded that email, on the theory, which he later admitted to me somewhat sheepishly over a much later dinner, that a company built on a decade-old cover-up would eventually produce a second, smaller cover-up out of pure habit, and that whoever was standing closest when it happened would need allies already in place. He had, in his own words, been building the net for a while. I just didn't know yet whose fall it was going to catch. I asked him that same much later dinner why he'd spent 8 years and what I would eventually learn was a genuinely uncomfortable amount of his own early capital buying up dead scraps of a company that had nothing to do with him. And he was quiet long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer at all, which was, by then, a thing I'd learned to recognize as Julian Croft's version of getting ready to say something true. My father ran a machine shop, he said finally. Small, 11 employees, most of them men who'd worked for him since before I was born. He turned down 3 buyout offers over the years from a company that wanted the property, not the business, because he said the men who worked there had families depending on that shop existing, and he wasn't going to trade 11 households worth of stability for a number that only made his own life easier. The 4th offer came with a supplier contract attached, steady, exclusive. Exactly the kind of deal a small shop spends a decade praying for. He took it. 18 months later, the supplier quietly, gradually, restructured the contract terms until the shop couldn't survive without accepting a buyout at a fraction of what it had been worth. Structured, I found out years later after I'd made enough money to actually hire people to look into it properly, by a holding company 2 layers removed from the same firm that made the original offer. It wasn't the same scale as what happened to your father. Nobody died. My father simply spent the last 9 years of his life running a smaller, sadder version of a company he used to be proud of, working for the same men who'd engineered its shrinking because the alternative was no shop at all. He looked at me and there was something in his face I hadn't seen before, something considerably less guarded than the version of him I'd spent a year learning to read. I started Voss Capital in part because I decided somewhere in my 20s that I was done watching patient men lose slowly to impatient ones simply because impatient men had better lawyers. I don't get to fix what happened to my father. I've spent a long time telling myself that fixing what happened to other people's fathers is close enough. I didn't say anything for a while after that. I understood finally, completely, why a man with no obvious personal stake in Callaway Dynamics had spent 8 years quietly buying up its bones, and I understood, too, that I hadn't been the only person in that relationship carrying a decade of grief around, dressed up as competence. We were, it turned out, exactly the same kind of tired. And that recognition did more to settle something in my chest than any grand declaration ever could have. What developed between us after that, over the following months, did not happen quickly, and it did not happen the way it happens in the stories Willow used to make me watch with her during slow afternoons at her apartment. All sweeping declarations and rain-soaked doorsteps. It happened in board memos he CC'd me on for no operational reason at all. It happened in a habit he developed of showing up at whatever unglamorous coffee shop I'd chosen that week, always with his own coffee already paid for, never asking, simply arriving. It happened on a Tuesday in January, when I mentioned entirely in passing that I hadn't slept properly since October. And he showed up at my apartment door 40 minutes later with a space heater because Beatrice had apparently mentioned, at some point in whatever 6-year business relationship the two of them had conducted under names I still didn't fully understand, that the heater in my building had never worked properly, and he had simply filed that fact away the way he filed everything, waiting for the moment it would matter. You don't have to keep doing things like this, I told him, standing in my doorway at 11 at night with a space heater between us like the world's least romantic bouquet. I know, he said. I'm aware that's generally understood to be the entire point of doing them. And then, because he was constitutionally incapable of letting a moment stay soft for longer than a sentence, he added, also, your radiator is a fire hazard, and I would prefer you not become the second Callaway to burn down in a building with faulty wiring, which should have been the least romantic sentence a man has ever said to a woman on her own doorstep, and which somehow, from him, in the specific, quiet delivery of someone who had clearly thought about that exact fear more than he was comfortable admitting, undid something in my chest that I had kept very carefully locked since I was 15 years old. I didn't kiss him that night. I want to be honest about the pace of things, because I think the versions of this story people tell themselves skip too quickly to the satisfying part and leave out the part where two people who have both spent their entire adult lives building careful, load-bearing walls around themselves take an embarrassingly long time to admit they'd like to stop. It was March before I let myself say anything true out loud, standing in the doorway of the half-renovated Callaway Tower lobby, surrounded by drop cloths and a floor plan neither of us had approved yet, when he asked, With the specific, careful neutrality of a man bracing for a rejection, he'd apparently decided he could survive, whether I intended this, meaning us, meaning whatever had been quietly accumulating between two people who kept finding excuses to stand near the same coffee machine, to remain a business arrangement indefinitely. I think, I said, that I've spent 9 years building a version of myself who doesn't need anyone to show up. I don't know how to undo that quickly, but you keep showing up anyway, and I've stopped being able to pretend I don't notice. That's not a no, he said. It's not a no, I agreed, and that was, as far as either of us was concerned, the entire declaration. We are not, either of us, people who require fireworks. We require someone who notices the radiator is broken and shows up with a space heater instead of a speech, and it turns out that's a rarer, better thing than any of Willow's television dramas ever gave it credit for being. I should mention, in the interest of full honesty, that I was not the only woman in Julian's orbit who had noticed him showing up places with quiet, unglamorous consistency. Genevieve Ashcroft Lyle, heiress to a shipping fortune roughly 4 times the size of what Whitfield Consolidated had ever been worth, had spent the better part of 2 years operating under the confident, socially reinforced assumption that she and Julian Croft were simply waiting for the correct, sufficiently impressive moment to formalize what half of the city's gala circuit had already decided was inevitable. She cornered me. There is genuinely no gentler word for what she did, at a fundraiser 11 months after the relaunch, in a hallway just off the main ballroom, wine glass held like a weapon she hadn't yet decided to use. "You're the Calloway girl," she said, in the specific tone of someone confirming a fact she'd already decided to be unimpressed by. I have to say, I admire the ambition. Building a whole company back from nothing is very inspiring. But I do think you should know, before you get too attached to the idea, that Julian and I have history that goes back considerably further than a business relationship built on a stolen algorithm. It wasn't stolen, I said mildly. He bought it at auction, legally, for $400 when he was 24 and nobody else wanted it. I understand the distinction matters to some of us more than others. Genevieve's smile thinned considerably. I'm simply saying, sweetheart, that Julian has always had a soft spot for a good sympathetic story. Orphaned heiress, tragic fire, stolen birthright, it's practically a fairy tale. I'd hate for you to mistake his generosity for something more permanent than it actually is. I want to tell you I had some devastating, cutting reply ready, the kind that would have made this scene sing in the version of the story where I'm cleverer under pressure than I actually am in real life. What I had instead was considerably more effective, mostly because it required no wit at all, only the truth, delivered flatly, the way Beatrice had taught me to deliver anything that needed to actually land. I think the difference, Genevieve, is that you've spent 2 years waiting for Julian to notice you at events exactly like this one, dressed exactly the way events like this one require, and he still hasn't. I've spent a year showing up to unglamorous coffee shops in whatever I happen to be wearing after a 12-hour workday, and he keeps showing up too. I'm not sure that's a story about my sympathetic circumstances. I think it might just be a story about the specific kind of attention he actually wants, versus the kind he's simply too polite to correct in public. She did not have a response to that. Julian, as it happened, had been standing just close enough around the corner to hear the entire exchange, a fact I only discovered when he appeared at my elbow 30 seconds later, took my hand with the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who has just watched something go exactly the way he'd hoped it would, without needing to intervene, and said, loudly enough for Genevieve to hear on her way past, "I believe this is our dance, if you're willing." We do not, either of us, actually dance well. We danced anyway, badly, for the specific pleasure of being seen doing it. And I understood, watching Genevieve Ashcroft Lyle disappear back into the crowd, that some victories require absolutely no rewind at all, only patience, and the simple, satisfying fact of already having won something a long time before anyone else noticed the game had started. Willow found me in the parking garage that night, mascara already ruined, the specific ruin of a woman who has just watched her fiancé escorted out of a building by security, while 40 board members and their spouses pretended very hard not to be enjoying it. "You did this," she said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know how, but you did this." "I filed my own work under my own name," I said. That's the entire scheme, Willow. I stopped letting people take things that weren't theirs. You could have just told me. About Owen. If you knew something, you could have just... I tried telling you I built the Meridian model, I said. You told me not to be sensitive. I don't think you actually want me to tell you things, Willow. I think you want me to keep being quiet enough that you never have to hear them. She didn't have an answer for that, which was, honestly, the first honest moment we'd had in 2 years. I need to tell you about the fire now because I've been circling it this whole time the way you circle a bruise you don't want to press on. And I think you deserve the actual night instead of the summary I usually give people who ask. I was 15. It was a Tuesday in March, and I remember it was a Tuesday because I'd had a math test that day that I never ended up taking, and some small, useless part of my brain has spent 9 years occasionally resurfacing that fact at 3 in the morning for no reason at all. My father had been fighting the board for 6 weeks by then, ever since the covenant on the Sutton loan tripped a technical default that nobody at Callaway Dynamics had budgeted a legal team large enough to fight. I didn't understand the mechanics of it at 15. I understood that my father had stopped sleeping, that my mother had started making phone calls in a low, careful voice after I'd gone to bed, and that Beatrice, who up until that spring had always been the person who brought over cookies on Sundays, had started coming by every single night instead, sitting at our kitchen table with my mother until well past midnight, the two of them going through binders of paper with the specific, grim focus of people trying to find a door in a room that had already been bricked over. The fire started in the garage, the same garage, as it happened, though rebuilt twice over by then, where my father had founded the company 18 years earlier, which either means nothing at all or means everything, depending on how much you want to believe the universe has a sense of irony. The official report called it an electrical fault in a space heater. Beatrice never believed that report for one single day of the 9 years since, and neither, once I was old enough to actually read it myself, did I. The fire started at 11:47 p.m., 40 minutes after the last light in my parents' study had gone out, in the one part of the house where my father kept a small fireproof safe containing the original founding documents and a set of ledgers he'd started keeping privately once he began to suspect the covenant default wasn't an accident. The safe was found afterward, opened, empty, its lock mechanism showing no sign of forced entry, sitting in the middle of a room that had otherwise burned down around it. I was asleep when Beatrice pulled me out of my bedroom window, because my bedroom was the one room in the house whose door didn't face the garage side, the side that went up first and fastest. I don't remember most of what happened between her hands closing around my arm and waking up 2 days later in a hospital room with my hair singed at one side and Beatrice sitting in a chair she had clearly not left, wearing the same clothes she'd been wearing that night. I remember she told me my parents hadn't made it out in time. I remember I didn't believe her, in the specific, useless way you don't believe things that are simply too large to fit through the door of your understanding all at once. What I found out much later, years later, in pieces, mostly from things Beatrice let slip when she thought I was old enough, and a few things I pieced together myself once I started digging through Whitfield Consolidated's shared drives at 2 in the morning, was that my father survived the fire itself. He had a heart attack 3 days later, in a temporary rental house Beatrice had arranged, the day after receiving formal notice that the board, under quiet pressure from an unnamed investment partner, whose name did not appear anywhere on the notice, but whose fingerprints were all over the loan structure that caused it, had voted to remove him as CEO of the company he'd built from a rented garage. He died holding a letter telling him he was no longer welcome inside the building that had his own name on the deed. My mother followed 11 months later. The death certificate says pneumonia. Beatrice has always said grief, plainly, without qualification, the way you say a fact you've simply decided to stop being polite about. Beatrice changed my name 3 weeks after the funeral. She didn't ask my permission exactly, not in a way a 15-year-old could meaningfully consent to, but she explained it to me at that same kitchen table, in the same low, careful voice she'd used with my mother during those last 6 weeks, and she told me the truth as plainly as she's told me everything since. Whoever had engineered my parents' ruin had done it carefully enough, patiently enough, that she genuinely did not know how far their reach extended, or whether a 15-year-old with the last name Callaway was a loose end somebody might eventually decide to tie off. I am not going to let you find out the hard way whether that fear is justified, she told me. You get to be safe first. You get to be Clara Sterling again when it's safe to be her, and not 1 day before. It took 9 years to be safe enough. I think, some nights, it still isn't entirely. And I think that's simply the shape grief takes when the people responsible for it are still walking around in expensive suits, attending galas you serve coffee at. I don't think I've told you enough about what Callaway Dynamics actually was before all of this. And I want to, because I think it matters that this wasn't simply a company my father owned, the way Robert Albright owned his. It was a company built entirely out of a specific, stubborn philosophy that my father repeated so often growing up that I could recite it before I understood what half the words meant. He used to say that most logistics companies treated efficiency as something you extracted from workers, squeezed a little harder every quarter until something eventually broke, and that he intended to build the opposite kind of company, one where efficiency came from removing friction, not people, where the goal of every system he designed was to make the humans running it need to work less hard, not more. The scheduling algorithm at the center of everything, the one Julian bought off a liquidation table for $400, wasn't originally built to maximize shareholder value at all. My father built the first version of it in our garage, on a second-hand computer, specifically because he'd watched one of his earliest drivers, a man named Ricardo Cruz, who'd been with the company since it was 3 trucks and a folding table, miss his own daughter's birthday 3 years running because the manual routing system Callaway Dynamics used at the time couldn't account for personal scheduling requests without throwing off the whole week's delivery timeline. My father spent 4 months building a system that could. Ricardo Cruz made every single one of his daughter's birthdays after that, until he retired, 12 years later, with a full pension and a handwritten letter from my father that Beatrice still has, framed, in her own office, because my father had sent her a copy the same week he sent the original. That's the company that got taken apart. Not a spreadsheet, not a stock ticker. A specific, deliberate philosophy about what work should cost the people doing it, embodied in a piece of code that a man like Arthur Beckett looked at and saw only as an asset to be extracted. The same way he looked at everything. The same way, I sometimes think, men like that look at people too. When I relaunched Callaway Dynamics, I kept my father's original mission statement, word for word, framed in the lobby, the same handwriting he'd used on Ricardo Cruz's letter, because Beatrice had kept the original draft in the same drawer as everything else she'd protected for 9 years. I added exactly 1 line beneath it, in my own handwriting, the first thing anyone sees walking into the building. Efficiency is not something you take from people. It's something you build so they don't have to give up as much of themselves to survive here. I don't know if my father would have written that sentence himself. I know he would have recognized every word of it as something he'd already spent his whole life trying to say. The reason I'm telling you all of this now, in the middle of Owen's unraveling, instead of at the start where it chronologically belongs, is that it was only after that dinner, after Owen was gone and the board had started asking questions Robert could no longer avoid, that I finally understood how close those two ruins, my father's and whatever was currently happening to Owen, actually stood next to each other. Robert Albright had signed a guarantee on a loan structured by a man named Arthur Beckett. Arthur Beckett's son had just been walked out of a board dinner in front of 40 people for building an almost identical trap, a decade later, against me. Some patterns are coincidence. This one was inheritance. Robert called me into his office himself, 3 weeks after the dinner, once the internal investigation had confirmed enough of the Halcyon transfer records that he could no longer pretend the story ended with Owen. He looked older than he had at the podium 2 months earlier, the specific older that comes from a man discovering the floor of his own building has several trap doors he simply never bothered to check for. "I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer, even if it costs me something," he said, which was, in itself, the single most human sentence I had ever heard him say. 9 years ago, this company's largest competitor collapsed under circumstances I signed my name to and never once, in a decade, asked a serious question about. I've started asking them this week. I don't like the answers I'm finding. I want to know if you already knew that before you ever walked into this building. I could have lied. I had, at that point, an entire life's worth of practice lying about exactly this. But I was tired, and Owen was gone, and some part of me had decided, somewhere between the stairwell and the board dinner, that I was done being smaller than the truth just to keep myself safe inside a building that had never once been safe for people like my father to begin with. "My name is Clara Sterling," I said. My father built the company your board helped dismantle 9 years ago. I've spent 2 years in your mailroom trying to find out exactly how much you knew about it." Robert didn't say anything for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had none of the boardroom polish I'd spent 2 years watching him perform. "I signed a guarantee Arthur Beckett told me was standard practice. I never read the covenant structure closely enough to understand what would trigger it, because reading it closely enough would have meant asking questions about a friend I didn't want to lose. I've spent 9 years telling myself that not knowing was the same as not being responsible." He looked at me, and for the first time in 2 years, he actually looked at me, the way you look at a person instead of a function. "I don't imagine that means very much to you. I don't imagine it should." "It doesn't fix anything," I said, "but it's more than anyone from this building has ever said to me before. I'll take honest over nothing." It wasn't forgiveness. I want to be clear about that, because I think stories like this one too often rush toward forgiveness as though it's owed on a schedule. And it isn't. And I didn't offer it that day, and I'm not sure I've fully offered it since. What I offered instead was a business proposition, the kind Beatrice had taught me to build long before I understood I'd ever get the chance to use it. Full cooperation with the ongoing investigation, complete access to Whitfield's records regarding the original Sutton loan, and, in exchange, my silence regarding exactly how long Robert had chosen comfort over curiosity. Not because he'd earned that silence, but because the company that employed several hundred people who'd had nothing to do with any of this didn't deserve to collapse for his decade of convenient ignorance. Beatrice, when I told her, said it was the single most Callaway thing I'd ever done, and from her, I understood that to be the highest compliment available. The full unraveling of the decade-old sabotage took another 4 months, and I'm not going to pretend it was clean or fast, because real reckonings rarely are. But between the IT trail, the halcyon recordings, Julian's patiently accumulated documentation of Arthur Beckett's original loan structuring, and, this part still makes something in my chest go tight when I think about it, a set of handwritten ledgers Beatrice had kept hidden in a safety deposit box for 9 years, meticulous, dated, cross-referenced, proof that the original covenant violations on my father's loan had been engineered on purpose, timed to trigger during a quarter Arthur Beckett knew, because he sat on an oversight committee, would leave Callaway Dynamics unable to refinance in time. Between all of it, the truth came out in pieces too large for anyone to keep pretending they were coincidences. I sat through 11 depositions over those 4 months, most of them as a witness rather than a party, and I want to tell you honestly that there is nothing glamorous about a deposition, no matter how satisfying the underlying story is. It is 6 hours in a windowless conference room, a stenographer typing every syllable, a lawyer named Carter Hayes, Owen's attorney, a man who had clearly built an entire career on the specific talent of making guilty clients sound merely misunderstood, asking me the same 3 questions in 11 different phrasings, hoping, I assume, that eventually I'd trip over my own timeline and hand him something he could use. "And you're certain," he asked me for the 4th time that afternoon, "that you had no advance knowledge whatsoever of the specific timing of Mr. Sutton's alleged unauthorized login?" "I'm certain," I said, which was, in the strictest technical sense, entirely true, because knowing Owen was building towards something and knowing the exact 5 minutes I would need to spend catching him were 2 very different kinds of knowledge, and I had learned, over 11 months of careful practice, exactly how to answer honestly about the second without ever once needing to mention the first. "You seem remarkably composed for someone who nearly lost her job and her professional reputation in a single afternoon," Whitby observed, in the leading, faintly accusatory tone lawyers use when they want a fact on the record without quite having the evidence to support the insinuation behind it. "I had a very good lawyer of my own preparing me for exactly this conversation," I said, which was true. Julian's legal team had spent 3 full evenings running me through every version of this exact exchange. And I had already survived considerably worse than a bad afternoon at Whitfield Consolidated, long before I ever set foot in that building. I don't rattle as easily as your client seems to have hoped. Whitby did not have a follow-up for that. Owen, sitting 3 seats down the table, would not meet my eyes for the remaining 2 hours of that session, and I understood, watching him stare fixedly at a spot on the conference table, that some part of him had finally fully absorbed the specific humiliation of having spent 2 years assuming I was too small to be dangerous, and having been proven wrong in the single most procedurally boring room available to prove anyone wrong in. Sylvia Caldwell's own deposition, 3 weeks later, was the one I actually wanted to attend in person rather than reading the transcript secondhand. And Beatrice came with me, both of us sitting quietly in the small gallery of chairs along the wall, while a woman we had never met before that day answered question after question about a decade she'd clearly spent trying very hard not to think about too closely. She was precise, unemotional, and devastatingly thorough, reading dates directly off her own handwritten notes without once needing to be prompted. And when opposing counsel, Edward Beckett's own attorney, in a moment of legal theater so on the nose I almost laughed out loud in a deposition room, which would have been considerably less professional than anything else I did that entire year, asked her why she'd kept such detailed personal notes on her employer's private instructions in the first place. She answered without a single flicker of hesitation. "Because I've worked for men like Arthur Beckett and Edward Beckett for 11 years, she said, and I learned a long time ago that the only protection available to someone in my position is a paper trail nobody can later claim doesn't exist. I kept those notes to protect myself. I'm glad today that protecting myself also happened to help someone else." Beatrice gripped my hand under the small gallery table so hard I felt it the next day, and neither of us said anything on the drive home, because some gratitude is too large to fit into words without spilling over into something neither of us was quite ready to let show in front of a stranger. Robert Albright had not orchestrated the original sabotage. I want to be fair about that, because Beatrice always insisted on being fair, even when it cost her something, and I've tried to learn that from her. He had signed a guarantee he did not fully understand the mechanics of, at the urging of a partner he trusted more than he should have, and he had spent a decade quietly, comfortably, profiting from the wreckage without ever once asking the kind of question that would have made the prophet feel less comfortable. That is its own kind of guilt. It is not the same kind as Arthur Beckett's, and it is not the same kind as his sons, who inherited both the fortune and, apparently, the appetite. I would like to tell you that once the truth came out, it simply won, cleanly, the way truth is supposed to in the versions of these stories with tidy endings. It did not. Arthur Beckett's younger brother, Edward, a corporate litigator who had spent 30 years making exactly this kind of mess disappear for exactly this kind of family, filed an emergency injunction the week after Owen's arrest, arguing that the original Callaway liquidation had been conducted in full legal compliance a decade earlier, that any current claim on the scattered intellectual property Julian had spent 8 years quietly reassembling constituted an unlawful attempt to relitigate a settled matter, and that, this was the part that actually frightened me, the first time I read it, sitting at Beatrice's kitchen table at midnight, with the filing spread across the same surface she'd once spread ledgers on with my mother, as my legal guardian during the relevant period, Beatrice herself could be named in a countersuit for fraudulent concealment of assets, given that she had, in fact, quietly held on to a set of my father's private ledgers for 9 years without ever formally disclosing them to a court. "He's not trying to win," Beatrice said, reading the filing twice, her face doing the particular still, controlled thing it did whenever she was genuinely afraid and refused to let it show. "He's trying to make it too expensive and too frightening for us to keep pushing. That's the entire Sutton method. It was the entire Sutton method a decade ago, too. Bury the truth under enough legal cost that the people telling it run out of money before the people hiding it run out of patience. I had one 5-minute window a day, and Edward Beckett had 30 years of exactly this kind of maneuvering, and for about a week, sitting in Julian's borrowed conference room, going through case law with a legal team he'd assembled faster than I'd known it was possible to assemble one, I genuinely believed we might lose, not because we were wrong, but because being right had never once, in this family's 10-year history with the Suttons, been sufficient on its own. The turn came from a source I hadn't expected at all. Sylvia Caldwell, Edward Beckett's own paralegal of 11 years, who called Julian's office directly, unprompted, 3 days before the injunction hearing, and asked, in a voice Julian described to me afterward as the specific tired voice of someone who has spent a decade filing paperwork for a man she stopped respecting a long time ago, whether anyone had ever actually asked her what she remembered about a set of destruction orders Arthur Beckett had issued to his firm's document storage facility 9 years earlier, 3 weeks after the Callaway liquidation closed. She remembered everything. She had, in fact, kept her own private notes at the time, not out of any grand moral courage, she was careful to clarify, but out of the specific, unglamorous self-preservation of a paralegal who had watched enough powerful men discover convenient amnesia to know it was worth keeping a record of what she'd actually been told to do, just in case anyone ever asked her to answer for it later. Her notes confirmed, in her own handwriting, dated and initialed, that Arthur Beckett had personally ordered the destruction of 17 boxes of Callaway Dynamics financial records 6 days after the liquidation. Records that legally should have been preserved for regulatory review, and that he had done so, in her recollection, in something close to a panic, a detail that meant considerably more to a judge than it might sound like on paper. Because innocent men rarely panic about paperwork nobody has asked them for yet. I did not need my 5 minutes for the hearing itself. I want that on the record, because I think there's a version of this story where the locket does all the work, and I get to stay comfortably passive while a magic pendant fixes my life for me. And that was never actually true. Not once. Not even close. What the locket gave me was 5 minutes a day to notice things other people missed. What actually won that hearing was Beatrice's 9 years of meticulous ledgers, Julian's 8 years of patient, unglamorous IP reassembly, Sylvia Caldwell's decade of unglamorous, unheroic self-preservation finally paying off for someone other than herself, and a judge who, faced with a destruction order dated 6 days after a liquidation and initialed by a woman with nothing left to gain from lying about it, was not remotely inclined to entertain Edward Beckett's argument that everything had been perfectly, boringly legal the entire time. The injunction was denied. Edward Beckett did not appeal, which told me, more clearly than any court filing could have, exactly how confident he'd actually been in his own case to begin with. He tried one more thing after that, and it is, I will admit, the single most satisfying afternoon of the entire ordeal. Precisely because it required no rewind at all, only money, patience, and the specific pleasure of watching a man discover in real time that he had badly misjudged the size of the check he was writing. The last significant piece of my father's original intellectual property that Julian hadn't already quietly acquired over his 8 patient years of collecting, the core routing algorithm beneath the scheduling system my father built in that garage, the one piece sophisticated enough that whoever held it effectively held the technical heart of what Callaway Dynamics used to be, had ended up, through a chain of liquidation sales even Julian's researchers had needed months to fully trace, in the hands of a dormant shell holding company that turned out 3 layers down to be controlled by Edward Beckett personally. He had never used it. He had simply held it, the way you hold a knife you don't intend to use yet, for 9 years. On the theory, I can only assume, that a Callaway might eventually resurface wanting it back, and that whoever resurfaced would need to come to him, hat in hand, to get it. He put it up for private auction instead, 3 weeks after the injunction failed, in what I understood immediately to be a calculated insult disguised as a business decision. Rather than simply selling it to me directly and ending the matter quietly, he structured a sealed bid sale open to qualified strategic buyers, which in practice meant every serious logistics and freight tech company in the country, ensuring that if I wanted the one piece of my father's legacy still sitting in enemy hands, I would have to outbid an entire industry for it, in public, with my name attached to every bid, so that whatever number I paid would be a matter of permanent record. A final, petty attempt to make my father's own invention cost me as much humiliation as possible on its way back to me. Julian wanted to structure our bid through one of his existing holding entities, quietly, the way he'd acquired everything else. I told him no. I've spent 9 years being quiet, I said, sitting in his office the night before the sealed bids were due, looking at a spreadsheet full of comparable valuations that all landed somewhere between $11 and $14 million for a piece of technology that, properly modernized, was worth considerably more than that to the right buyer. I don't want to win this one quietly. I want my actual name on the winning bid, in a room full of people who spent a decade telling themselves my family didn't matter enough to remember. We bid $18 million, publicly, under Callaway Dynamics' own name, $4 million above the highest comparable valuation any analyst in the room could justify on paper, because I did not, in the end, care whether it was the most efficient number. I cared that it was a number large enough that nobody in that auction house, when the sealed bids were opened 3 days later, in front of representatives from 6 competing firms and, as it happened, Edward Beckett himself, sitting quietly in the back of the room the way men like that always do, could pretend the Callaway name was still something a serious buyer could afford to outbid. The auctioneer read the winning number out loud. 18 million, from Callaway Dynamics, represented by Clara Sterling, and I watched Edward Beckett's face do the exact thing Owen's face had done in that boardroom 8 months earlier. The specific, silent recalibration of a man discovering that the quiet, harmless girl he'd spent a decade assuming didn't exist anymore had just, very publicly, very expensively, proven otherwise. He didn't say a word to me on the way out. He didn't need to. I had already gotten everything I came for, and it wasn't the algorithm, though I was glad to have that back too. It was the specific, permanent, notarized fact that when the Sutton family finally tried to make a Callaway pay one last humiliating price for wanting back what was rightfully hers, she'd simply written the check, in full, in public, under her own name, and walked out without so much as glancing back at the man who'd spent a decade betting she never would. Edward Beckett's own firm quietly dissolved 18 months later, not because of anything I did directly, but because a litigator who has just publicly, expensively lost a fight he engineered specifically to be unwinnable for the other side tends to discover, rather quickly, that clients stop trusting him to engineer anything at all. I heard, secondhand, through Sylvia Caldwell, who kept in occasional touch with Beatrice afterward in the easy, unforced way people do once they've survived something difficult standing on the same side of it, that he retired to a smaller practice, handling uncontested estate filings 2 states over, the exact kind of quiet, unglamorous, powerless work he'd spent 30 years making sure other people were forced into instead of him. I did not feel triumphant hearing it. I felt mostly the specific relief of a door finally, completely closing on a chapter I had spent 9 years afraid might never actually end. I drove out to the cemetery the week after the auction, alone, the way I always did, though I brought something with me that time I never had before. A printed copy of the winning bid confirmation, $18 million, Callaway Dynamics, my own name typed cleanly at the bottom. My parents' headstones sit side by side under a maple tree Beatrice picked out specifically because my mother had always wanted one planted in our old backyard and never gotten the chance. And I sat on the grass between them for a long time before I said anything at all, the way I always do. Because grief, it turns out, does not actually require you to fill every silence with words. "We got it back," I told them finally, quietly, the paper resting on my knee. "Not all of it. I don't think all of it is a thing that's actually possible to get back. But the part that was still findable, we found. Beatrice kept every single ledger. I kept the name. And Dad," my voice did the thing it always does at this exact point, the small catch that never quite smooths out no matter how many times I practice this conversation in my head on the drive over. Ricardo Cruz's granddaughter reached out to Callaway Dynamics last month, completely unprompted, applying for a logistics coordinator position. I hired her myself. She has your handwriting philosophy framed in her cubicle, the one from the letter you sent him. She didn't even know I'd be the one interviewing her. She just wanted to work somewhere that still believed what you used to believe. Her name is Sophia Cruz, which is not, as far as either of us has ever been able to determine, any relation to the woman who runs the coffee cart outside Callaway Tower. A coincidence I've never quite stopped finding gently, quietly funny in a way I've never fully explained to either of them. She works 2 floors below my office now, in exactly the routing department her grandfather once drove trucks for, and she stopped by my office unprompted, 3 months into the job, holding a printout of a scheduling model she'd improved on her own time, unassigned, the same way I once built an entire supply chain model on midnight hours nobody had asked me to spend. I read every line of it standing at my own desk, and I told her, the way I wished someone had told me 2 years sooner than anyone actually did, that her name was already on the file, that it would stay there through every revision, and that if anyone ever tried to change that, she was to come find me immediately, whatever it cost. She looked, standing in my doorway, exactly the way I imagine I must have looked the day Margaret Rossi first asked me a question in front of an entire boardroom and expected, for the first time in 2 years, an honest answer instead of a script, startled, slightly disbelieving, and quietly, carefully, beginning to trust that the ground beneath her might actually hold. I don't know if grief ever actually resolves into something you'd call peace. I think some days it simply becomes quieter, less like a wound and more like a room in a house you've learned to walk through without stubbing your toe on the same furniture every single time. I sat with them until the light started to go gold and low across the grass, the specific quality of afternoon light my mother always used to call the good hour, and then I got up, brushed the grass off my knees, and drove back into the city, because there was still a company to run, and a name to keep spelling correctly, and a table full of people waiting for me to show up for the ordinary, unglamorous work of an ordinary Tuesday. Owen was indicted for corporate espionage and securities fraud 11 months later. I did not attend the sentencing. I sent Beatrice instead, because some closures belong to the person who waited 9 years for them, and this one was hers as much as mine. She told me about it that same evening at the kitchen table, over soup neither of us finished. Owen had worn a suit that no longer fit him quite as well as it once had, she said, the specific ill fit of a man who has spent several months eating badly and sleeping worse, and he had not looked at the gallery once during the reading of the sentence, which surprised her, given how much of his entire personality had always seemed to depend on being watched. He received 4 years, with the possibility of early release after 2.5, and a restitution order that would follow him for the rest of his working life, effectively ensuring that whatever career he attempted to rebuild afterward would always, eventually, run into a paper trail with his own name on it. Beatrice said the only moment he showed any real emotion at all was when the judge read the restitution figure out loud. And I understood hearing that even at the very end, the thing that broke through Owen Beckett's careful composure wasn't guilt. It was the bill. Willow did not attend the sentencing either, as it turned out, though not, Beatrice told me, out of any loyalty withheld. She'd simply already ended the engagement 3 months earlier, quietly, without any of the dramatics I might once have expected from her. In a single text message Owen's lawyer later entered, oddly, into an unrelated civil filing. I can't keep pretending I didn't know more than I let myself admit. I'm sorry for what that cost her. I hope you never get the chance to do it to anyone else. It was, I thought, reading it secondhand months later, the closest thing to genuine growth I ever saw evidence of in Willow Albright. And I have chosen, deliberately, to let that be the last word I hold on to about her, rather than the 2 years that came before it. Jocelyn, of all people, ended up surprising me the most. I fully expected once the truth came out that she would either quietly resign out of embarrassment or continue exactly as she always had, oblivious and unbothered, the way people who exist primarily to relay other people's decisions often manage to remain unbothered by even the largest earthquakes happening directly beneath them. She did neither. She requested a meeting with me herself 3 weeks after Owen's administrative leave began, sat down across from me with none of her usual scattered energy and said, "I want to apologize properly, and I want you to actually believe I mean it, which I understand is a lot to ask, given how I've treated you for 2 years. You told me gratitude was a good look on me," I said, not unkindly, but not letting her off the hook either. "I know," she said. "I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything else I've ever said in my professional life. I want you to know I've requested a transfer to compliance. Actual paperwork this time, actually read before it's filed. I'd like to spend the rest of my career actually noticing things instead of just relaying whatever the loudest person in the room told me to say." She became, over the following 2 years, one of Beatrice's most meticulous junior compliance officers at Callaway Dynamics, a fact neither of us has ever mentioned to the other out loud, because some redemptions are better left quietly respected than loudly discussed. Willow left Whitfield Consolidated the following spring. Not fired, not exactly. Robert simply stopped protecting her from the consequences of her own choices, which turned out to be a harsher sentence than any HR department could have written. Last I heard, she was working an account coordinator role at a mid-size marketing firm 2 cities over. The kind of job with a badge and a cubicle and absolutely no one applauding anything she presents. I don't feel triumphant about that either, if I'm honest. I mostly just feel like a very long exhale. I want to tell you about Catherine Albright, too, Robert's wife, Willow's mother, because for 2 years I had assumed she simply didn't exist in any capacity beyond appearing at galas in expensive dresses and laughing at things her husband said whether or not they were funny. And it turned out that assumption said considerably more about how carefully she'd chosen to be underestimated than it said about who she actually was. She requested a private meeting with me 2 weeks after Owen's arrest, in a tea room downtown neither of us had any professional reason to be in, and she came in without any of the practiced social warmth she performed at company events, sat down across from me, and said, without any preamble at all, "I knew Willow was taking credit for your work. I've known for over a year. I told myself it wasn't my business to interfere in how my daughter built her career, and I want you to understand, sitting across from you now, exactly how much I regret hiding behind that excuse." I didn't know what to say to that. Nobody in that family had ever apologized to me for anything, and I had stopped expecting it the way you stop expecting rain in a drought. Not because you've made peace with it, but because hoping for it has simply become an inefficient use of your remaining energy. Willow has a younger half-sister, Catherine told me, which I hadn't known, because Whitfield family history had never once, in 2 years, come up in a context anyone bothered explaining to the intern. Her name is Celeste. She's from Robert's first marriage, and Willow has spent her whole life making sure nobody at that company ever had to think about her, because Celeste was better at almost everything Willow wanted credit for, and being better quietly, without demanding an audience for it, made her easy to sideline. I let that happen too. I have let a great many things happen quietly in that family, Miss Hart, and I am television villain enough to admit I did it because it was easier than the alternative. Celeste Albright, when I finally met her 3 weeks later at Catherine's quiet insistence, turned out to be a soft-spoken, ferociously competent supply chain analyst who had spent 6 years in Whitfield Consolidated's Denver office, specifically because it kept her far enough from her father's favoritism that she could actually build a reputation on her own work instead of fighting for scraps of credit in a building where her half-sister had first claim on every room. She had, it turned out, quietly rebuilt an entire regional distribution model from scratch 2 years earlier, saving the company $11 million a year, and had been thanked for it with a modest bonus and a congratulatory email from a regional VP who never once mentioned her name to the board. Robert, once the full shape of Owen's scheme and his own decade of convenient blindness had finally fully landed on him, did something I genuinely did not expect from a man I had spent 2 years cataloging every flaw of. He called an all-staff meeting, in the same auditorium where Willow had once stood at a podium reading my supply chain model back to me as her own, and he stood up in front of the entire company and named Celeste Albright the new head of strategic growth, the position Owen had vacated, effective immediately, and he said in front of everyone, "This should have happened years ago. I let my own comfort get in the way of recognizing who was actually doing the work that kept this company standing. I don't intend to make that mistake twice." He did not look at me when he said it, but I understood, sitting in my usual folding chair by the door for the last time, that some part of that sentence had my name written into it, whether or not he'd said it out loud. Robert and I have lunch every quarter now, an arrangement neither of us formally proposed, but that simply started happening, once a season. Always at the same unremarkable diner Beatrice took me to the night of the board dinner, a choice I made deliberately the first time, and that Robert, to his credit, never once questioned or tried to upgrade to somewhere more befitting a man of his position. We don't talk about the fire. We don't talk about Arthur Beckett, or the guarantee he signed without reading closely enough, or the 9 years he spent comfortable in his own convenient ignorance. We talk about supply chains mostly, and about Celeste's steady, unglamorous rise through strategic growth, which he mentions every single time with the specific, quiet pride of a father finally learning to notice the daughter who was doing the work all along, and about Catherine, who apparently took up painting the year after everything fell apart, and has, according to Robert, gotten alarmingly good at it in a way that seems to surprise no one but him. "I don't expect you to have forgiven any of it," Robert told me at one of these lunches, a little over a year after the relaunch, turning his coffee cup in slow circles the way he does whenever he's working up to saying something he finds difficult. "I wouldn't ask you to. I just want you to know that not a single quarter goes by where I don't think about the 80-hour weeks it took your father to build something I helped tear down without ever once asking a hard question about it. These lunches are the only penance I know how to actually pay that doesn't feel like it's asking something from you in return." "I don't come to these lunches for penance, Robert," I told him, and I meant it. I come because Whitfield Consolidated and Callaway Dynamics are going to be doing business with each other for the rest of both our careers, whether either of us particularly enjoys the history behind that fact. And I've decided I'd rather build that relationship on quarterly lunches at a diner than on quiet resentment neither of us ever says out loud. That's not forgiveness. It's just practical, I suppose. My father always said the safest business relationship is the one built on the version of the truth you're both willing to keep saying out loud, even when it's uncomfortable. This is me trying that his way for once, instead of Beatrice's. Robert didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Your father sounds like he was a considerably better man than I managed to be for most of my career." And I told him honestly that he was, and that it didn't mean Robert had run out of time to be a better one for whatever was left of his own. We went to the county courthouse together on a gray Wednesday morning to file the name restoration paperwork, Beatrice and I, the same courthouse where she'd filed the original change 9 years earlier, a fact neither of us mentioned out loud but which sat between us the entire drive there, heavy and obvious as a third passenger. The clerk who processed it was young, bored, clearly processing her 40th form of the day, and she read my old name and my restored name off the paperwork in the same flat, disinterested tone she probably used for every name that crossed her desk, utterly unaware that she was the final administrative note in a 9-year composition neither she nor anyone else in that building would ever fully understand the shape of. "Anything else you need today?" she asked, already reaching for the next folder in her queue. "No," I said. "That's everything." And it was, in the end, everything. 9 years, 1 fire, 1 liquidation, 1 locket, 1 auction, 1 board dinner, 1 CEO who finally asked an honest question, compressed down into a single stamped form a board clerk filed without looking up twice. Beatrice squeezed my hand in the hallway outside, once, hard, and neither of us said anything else about it for the rest of the day. Because some victories are too large to discuss in the same breath as the small administrative moment that finally makes them official. There is a specific, strange kind of vertigo that comes with legally reclaiming a name you were made to set down at 15. And I don't think anyone warns you about it, because from the outside it looks like the easiest part of the whole ordeal. A form, a filing fee, a new driver's license. When in reality it took me the better part of a year to stop flinching, slightly, every time someone said, "Clara Sterling," out loud in a professional context. The way you flinch at a sound you associate with danger long after the danger itself has passed. Beatrice noticed it before I did, the way she noticed almost everything. "You're allowed to just be her now," she told me quietly, the week the legal paperwork finalized. "You don't have to keep bracing for someone to take it away again." I signed the lease on Callaway Tower's new headquarters, the actual, physical building, 11 stories of glass, 2 blocks from where Whitfield Consolidated still stood, close enough that Robert could see it from his own office window if he wanted to, which I understood to be its own quiet, deliberate kind of statement, under my full legal name for the first time in 9 years. And I remember standing in the empty lobby the week before the official relaunch, before any furniture had arrived, before the sign had gone up outside, just standing there in a coat that was mine, under a name that was mine, in a building that would soon have my father's mission statement in my own handwriting on the wall. And I cried for considerably longer than the one stop on that commuter train 2 years earlier. Not out of grief this time, but out of something closer to relief, so large it needed somewhere to go. The sign went up on a Tuesday, of course it did, a simple, clean word mark. Callaway Dynamics, in the same typeface my father had used on the original garage door, which Beatrice had photographed, once, years before the fire, on nothing more than a whim, a photograph that turned out to be the only surviving image of that door anywhere. I watched the installation crew mount it from the sidewalk across the street, Beatrice on one side of me, Julian on the other, Mira and Celeste a few steps back, arguing genially about something entirely unrelated. And when the crew finally stepped back, and the afternoon light caught the letters properly for the first time, I understood, standing there on an ordinary Tuesday sidewalk in a coat that was mine, that this was the actual ending I had been building toward for 9 years. Not the auction, not the board dinner, not even the moment Owen carried his own box of desk plants out of a building he no longer worked in. Just a name, spelled correctly, on a door. catching the light exactly the way it always should have. Callaway Dynamics relaunched 18 months after that stairwell, funded jointly by Voss Capital and a controlling stake I hold personally under my actual name. On the door, in the filings, on the masthead, spelled correctly, credited accurately, exactly the way it should have been the entire time. Julian sits on the board. He also, as of last spring, sits across from me at a kitchen table most Sunday mornings, which took considerably longer to arrange than the corporate takedown did, mostly because both of us are, by disposition, extremely bad at admitting we want things out loud. I still have the locket. I still get exactly 5 minutes a day, and some mornings I use them on nothing more dramatic than making sure I don't burn the coffee, because it turns out that once you've spent a year rebuilding your father's company from the ashes of a decade-long conspiracy, you develop a genuine appreciation for days that don't require rescuing. Beatrice got her own reckoning in the end, though it took the longest to arrive, and I think it mattered to her the most, in the quiet, unglamorous way the things that matter most to careful people usually do. 9 years of ledgers, 9 years of a name changed on a whim of self-preservation, 9 years of Thursday night soup and a drawer under my bed meant for hiding things. All of it got a single afternoon, 18 months after the relaunch, when Callaway Dynamics held its first official shareholder meeting in its new tower, and I stood at the podium, the actual podium, under my actual name, and introduced Beatrice Vance, her real name, not Hart, the name she'd worn for me instead of herself for 9 straight years, as the company's new chief compliance officer, the person whose entire professional life had been built, whether she ever meant it to or not, around making absolutely certain nobody in this building would ever again get away with what was done to my father. She did not cry, because Beatrice does not cry in rooms full of shareholders, but she gripped the edge of the podium hard enough that I saw her knuckles go white, and she looked at me for a long moment before she stepped up to speak, and I understood, in that look, that whatever else this had cost either of us, it had been worth it, finally, completely, to both of us at once. I want to tell you about the first real crisis I faced as CEO, because I think it matters that the version of me who eventually ran that company learned to do it without a magic pendant doing the hard work for her. And because it happened on a night the locket genuinely could not have helped me at all. 6 months into the relaunch, a winter storm system that no forecast had adequately predicted shut down 3 major freight corridors simultaneously, stranding roughly 40% of Callaway Dynamics' active shipments across 2 states, on the exact week we were finalizing our largest new client contract since the relaunch, a mid-size regional grocery chain whose entire holiday inventory depended on us delivering on time. There was no 5-minute rewind that fixed physics. ICE does not care about borrowed time. I spent 31 hours straight in the operations center, coordinating rerouting with a logistics team that had never faced a crisis of this scale under my leadership, fielding a furious call from the grocery chain's own CEO at 3 in the morning, and making the specific, expensive decision against the advice of 2 board members who argued it would set a damaging precedent for margins, to charter emergency air freight for the client's most time-sensitive inventory at a cost that ate our entire quarterly profit on that account. "You're going to lose money on this contract," Mira told me at 4 in the morning, running the numbers in front of me with the specific, exhausted bluntness of someone who trusted me enough not to soften it. "Badly. This quarter at least." "I know," I said. "Do it anyway. My father used to say the safest choice is the one you'd still be comfortable explaining to the people who lost their jobs if it went wrong. I'd rather explain a bad quarter to this board than explain to that grocery chain's employees why their holiday shelves are empty because we chose our margin over their deadline. We delivered on time at a loss, and the grocery chain's CEO called me himself the following week, not to complain, but to extend the contract for another 3 years, specifically citing, in his own words, the kind of partner who shows up when it actually costs them something to. It was, in its own unglamorous way, more satisfying than the auction had been, because nobody handed me that win. There was no folder sliding across a table, no 5 minutes spent catching someone else's mistake. It was just 31 hours of exhaustion, one expensive decision made on principle, and the specific, quiet proof that the company I'd rebuilt could survive a crisis the locket had absolutely nothing to offer against. Julian proposed on a Tuesday, which tells you almost everything you need to know about him, because he is constitutionally incapable of treating a Tuesday as an insufficiently significant day for something that matters, on the theory, which he explained to me afterward with a straight face, that the version of this where I wait for some arbitrary romantic date just tells you I was performing the moment instead of simply being ready for it. And I was ready on a Tuesday, so it happened on a Tuesday. He did it in the same unglamorous coffee shop where he'd first slid a folder across the table and said the word earned at the same corner table, and he did not kneel, because we had discussed it in advance and agreed the whole tradition made us both faintly uncomfortable in a way neither of us had the energy to perform through, and he simply set a small box on the table next to my coffee and said, "I would like the rest of my Tuesdays to look like this one, if that's something you'd decided building with me." Which is, by any reasonable measurement, the least conventionally romantic proposal in the recorded history of proposals, and which is also, without any competition at all, the only one I would have said yes to. We were married the following autumn, in the courtyard behind Callaway Tower, under the same maple-adjacent light my father's mission statement quotes on the lobby wall, in a ceremony small enough that Genevieve Ashcroft Lyle was not invited, and large enough that Grace Adewale flew in specifically to attend, sitting in the second row beside Mira and Celeste, the three of them already by the reception, deep in an argument about regional logistics benchmarks that had nothing to do with weddings at all. Beatrice walked me down the short aisle herself, because there was never any question who else it could have been. And she cried. Finally, properly, the way she hadn't at the shareholder meeting, the way I don't think she'd let herself cry in 9 full years. And I understood, watching her, that some grief only finishes arriving once you've built something solid enough on the other side of it to finally set the weight down. Robert and Catherine sent a gift, an antique compass, the kind with a brass casing, no note attached except a single line in Robert's own handwriting. For the parts of the journey a map can't cover. I keep it on my desk at Callaway Tower, next to the framed photograph of the original garage door, and I have never fully decided whether it was meant as an apology, a peace offering, or simply the closest thing Robert Albright has ever managed to genuine tenderness. And I have decided, in the end, that it doesn't especially matter which. I keep it anyway. Julian gave a toast that evening that ran, by his own admission, considerably longer than he'd planned, mostly because he kept stopping to correct himself mid-sentence, dissatisfied with each version of saying the thing he was trying to say, until he finally landed on something simple enough to actually finish. I spent 8 years collecting the scattered pieces of a company I thought I was rebuilding out of guilt from my own father. It took me considerably longer to realize I was actually just waiting for the one person who'd know exactly what to do with all of it once she finally walked back into the room. I'm glad I waited. I'd wait considerably longer if she asked me to. I did not cry as visibly as Beatrice had, mostly out of sheer stubbornness, but I came close enough that Mira slid me a napkin under the table without either of us needing to discuss why. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the courtyard string lights had been switched off, one strand at a time by a tired but cheerful catering crew, Julian and I sat alone at the head table for a few extra minutes, not saying much, simply watching the last of the candles burn down. I touched the locket at my collarbone without quite meaning to, an old habit that had never fully gone away even after everything it had already given me. "Do you ever wonder what you'd have done with those 5 minutes if none of this had ever happened?" he asked, not really expecting an answer, the specific quiet question people ask each other at the very end of a long, good day when the asking matters more than the answer. "I used to think I'd have wasted them," I said honestly, turning the small tarnished oval over once between my fingers. "Small things, catching a bus, winning an argument nobody would remember by morning. I don't think that anymore. I think I'd have found something worth spending them on eventually, the same way my mother must have, and her mother before her. I think that's just what the women in my family have always done with whatever small, unfair advantage the world occasionally hands us. We find something worth spending it on, and then we build something sturdy enough that we don't have to keep spending it forever." Julian didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. He simply took my hand, the same steady, unhurried way he'd taken it the first time, in a hallway full of people who had no idea yet what either of us was actually capable of, and we sat there together until the last candle finally burned itself out on its own. Mira became Callaway Dynamics Director of Analytics 11 months into the relaunch, running a department twice the size of the one she'd been quietly overqualified for at Whitfield. And she still, to this day, forwards me things in case I want the raw numbers, a small habit neither of us has ever needed to explain to the other. I offered her the role in person, at the same break room table where she'd first told me years earlier that Willow had kept my typo in slide 6, and she looked at me for a long moment before she said anything at all. "I always kind of suspected you knew things you shouldn't have been able to know," she said finally. Not quite a question. "The Larkspur thing. The audit trail showing up so fast that night with Owen. I used to lie awake wondering if you had some kind of source inside Robert's office I didn't know about. Would it change your answer if I told you the truth was stranger than a source in Robert's office?" I asked, only half joking, because by then I trusted her enough to have actually told her, if she'd pushed, and some small, reckless part of me wanted her to push. She considered that for a moment, swirling her coffee, and then she laughed, the specific warm laugh of someone deciding, deliberately, not to open a door she suspected might change how she saw a friendship she valued too much to risk. "You know what? I don't actually want to know. I've decided you're either supernaturally lucky or quietly brilliant in ways you've never fully explained to me, and either answer means I want to keep working with you for the rest of my career. I don't need the mechanism, I just need the results." She held out her hand. "Director of Analytics. I accept, obviously, but I want it on record that I'm accepting mostly so I can keep forwarding you things and finally getting a straight answer back within the hour instead of within 3 days." We shook on it, and I never did tell her about the locket, though I've sometimes wondered on quiet nights whether she's guessed considerably more than she's ever let on, in the same careful, generous way she noticed a stolen typo 2 years before anyone else in that building bothered to look closely enough to see it. Every December since the relaunch, we've gathered at Beatrice's house for a dinner that has slowly, without anyone officially deciding it should, become a tradition. Beatrice at the head of the table, the way she was always meant to sit at one. Julian bringing a bottle of wine he inevitably describes in more technical detail than the room actually wants. Mira arguing genially with Celeste Albright, who joined us the second year running, about whose regional model actually performed better under stress testing. And Jocelyn, quiet and steady these days, bringing a dessert she's gotten genuinely good at making. The specific quiet pride of someone who has spent several years proving to herself, more than to anyone else, that she is capable of being more careful than she once was. My father's photograph sits on the mantel behind us during that dinner, the one surviving picture Beatrice kept of him, standing outside the original garage. And every year, at some point in the evening, usually after the second glass of wine, someone raises a glass to him without anyone needing to suggest it first. And I think, every single time, that this is the actual company he was building all along, whether he knew it or not. Not the algorithm, not the patents, not even the tower with his name spelled correctly on the door, but a table full of people who show up for each other, consistently, without needing to be asked twice. I want to tell you honestly about the one time I saw Willow again in person, because I think it matters more than the version of this story where I simply watched her through a coffee shop window and felt smugly satisfied from a safe distance. And because that isn't, in the end, actually what happened. I want to end where all of this actually ends, which is not with the auction, or the wedding, or even the compass on my desk, but with an ordinary Tuesday 2 years after the whole thing began. Because I think the truest measure of everything Beatrice and I built is simply how unremarkable my days have finally become. 2 years to the month after that boardroom presentation, I walked into a coffee shop 3 blocks from Callaway Tower's new address for an ordinary Tuesday meeting and found Willow standing at the counter ahead of me in a blazer 2 seasons out of style, counting change out of a small zippered wallet with the specific, careful patience of someone who has learned, recently and without much grace, exactly what things cost. She saw me before I could decide whether to say anything at all, and for a moment neither of us moved, 2 years of history compressing itself into the 3 feet of tile between us. "Clara," she said, and then, because some habits die slower than others, "I mean, Miss Callaway. I read about the relaunch. Everyone did." She looked, for the first time in the entire 2 years I'd known her, genuinely uncertain of her own next sentence, which was, I realized, the first time I had ever seen Willow Albright without a script already loaded and ready to perform. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know why you'd want nothing to do with me. I wanted to say it, if you'll let me." I took things from you for 2 years and told myself it wasn't really taking because we were friends. And I don't think I actually believed we were friends. I think I just needed it to be true so I wouldn't have to feel what I'm feeling right now. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything. I thought about a great many things in the 4 or 5 seconds it took me to answer her. The stairwell, the podium, all the small cruelties I'd cataloged and never once needed to weaponize because Owen did the work of destroying himself all on his own. The version of me who used to sit in the back row of folding chairs and smile at gratitude she didn't feel. I thought mostly about what Beatrice had told me the very first week I ever set foot in that mailroom. That the point was never simply to make the people who hurt you feel small. The point was to make sure the truth finally weighed more than the lie had, so that it could never again be picked up and used against someone else the way it had been used against my father. It doesn't fix it, I agreed, but it's the first true thing you've ever said to me, and I'd rather have that than another 2 years of pretend gratitude. I paid for her coffee before she could reach the register, not out of generosity exactly, and not out of forgiveness either, but because I had learned, finally, after everything, that the sweetest revenge available to anyone is simply becoming the kind of person who no longer needs the ledger to balance in order to sleep at night. I did, however, send an email later that same afternoon, the kind with my actual name on it, approving a modest but very public community grant Callaway Dynamics was funding at the mid-size marketing firm 2 cities over, where Willow happened to work. Purely on the merits of the proposal, purely coincidentally, purely because I had also learned that the second sweetest revenge available to anyone is being generous enough, publicly enough, that the person who once tried to erase your name never gets to forget whose signature made the good thing possible. Willow sent me a short note the following week, the first unprompted message she'd sent me in over 2 years that didn't involve asking for something. It said only, "I saw the grant. I don't know what to say except thank you, and I'm sorry it took me losing everything to learn how to say it properly." I didn't reply right away. I sat with it for a full day, the way Beatrice taught me to sit with anything that mattered before deciding what to do with it. And then I wrote back 3 words, "No more." Because I'd learned by then that some sentences are strongest exactly when they refuse to carry more weight than they need to. You're welcome, Willow. It was, as far as I know, the last thing either of us ever said to the other, and I've found in the 2 years since that it was exactly enough. I didn't need the 5 minutes for that one. Some things you get to enjoy in real time. There is one last thing I want to tell you, because I think it's the part that actually matters more than any of the rest of it. More than the auction, more than the board dinner, more than watching Owen carry a box of his own desk plants out of a building he'd never once imagined he could lose. Callaway Dynamics runs an internship program now, the first thing I insisted on once the relaunch was stable enough to afford one, structured very deliberately around a single rule Beatrice and I wrote into the founding charter together. Every intern gets their name on their own work, every time, without exception. Enforced not as a courtesy, but as a fireable offense for whoever violates it. I sat in on final interviews for the first cohort myself, 18 months ago, and I remember one candidate in particular, a quiet, watchful young woman named Lena, who had clearly rehearsed her answers so many times they'd stopped sounding rehearsed, who mentioned, almost apologetically, near the end of the interview, that she'd built an entire supply forecasting model on her own laptop for her previous internship. Unassigned, unpaid, on her own time, because she'd wanted to prove she was capable of more than the calendar management she'd actually been hired to do. I hired her on the spot, before the rest of the panel had finished their notes, and I told her afterward, in the hallway, the only piece of advice I actually meant to give her. If anyone in this building ever tries to put their name on something you built, you come straight to me, and I promise you, whatever it costs, we will fix it the same day. She looked at me like she didn't quite believe an executive could mean something like that sincerely, and I understood that look completely, because I had worn it myself for 2 full years before anyone ever gave me a reason to stop. She came to me 4 months later on a Wednesday, standing in my office doorway with the specific, careful posture of someone bracing to be told she was overreacting. A senior analyst named Jarrett, 3 years into his tenure and considerably too comfortable in it, had taken a distribution model Lena built during her second week, an elegant piece of work, cleaner than anything I'd been capable of at that age, and presented it to a regional client the following morning as his own, with Lena's name nowhere in the file metadata, which he had apparently specifically taken the time to strip out. I did not need 5 minutes to handle it. I needed considerably less than that because the entire charter of that company had been built deliberately, brick by brick, around exactly this moment. I pulled the file's original creation timestamp within 90 seconds, confirmed Lena's authorship against her own saved drafts, and called Jarrett into my office before lunch. He did not get the benefit of a board dinner, or a slow 4-month unraveling, or any of the elaborate architecture Owen Beckett's downfall had required, because Owen Beckett's downfall had required all of that specifically so that a company without a rule against exactly this behavior could be forced, reluctantly, publicly, to finally enforce one. Callaway Dynamics already had the rule. Jarrett was terminated that same afternoon, with cause, and Lena's name went on to the client-facing revision of the model within the hour, properly credited, exactly the way it always should have been from the very start. "That's it?" Lena asked me afterward, standing in the same doorway, looking faintly stunned at how quickly and completely the matter had simply been closed. "It's just over." "Just like that?" "It's just over," I confirmed. "That's the entire point of building it this way, Lena. You shouldn't have to spend 2 years proving you deserve to be believed before anyone finally checks the timestamp. I built this place so you'd never have to." She didn't say anything for a moment, and then she said quietly, "I want to build things here for a long time." And I understood, hearing it, that this, not the auction, not the $18 million, not even the sign catching the light on an ordinary Tuesday, was the actual final proof that everything Beatrice and I had spent 9 years fighting for had actually, finally, taken root somewhere solid enough to outlast us. I think about the women in my family sometimes, the ones Beatrice told me about that Thursday night. 4 generations of them stretching back to a village neither of us can spell correctly. Each one carrying this same strange, narrow gift, 5 minutes at a time, spending it carefully, rarely, on exactly the things that mattered most, in exactly the moment they mattered most. I don't know most of their names. I don't know what any of them actually did with their 5 minutes, whether one of them once used it to catch a falling child, or reword a single sentence that saved a marriage, or simply quietly get somewhere on time that mattered more than anyone watching could have known. I like to imagine, though, that whatever they did with it, it looked less like magic and more like what mine has looked like. Ordinary, unglamorous, 90% administrative damage control, and 10% genuine rescue, spent by ordinary women trying to hold together lives that kept trying to come apart at exactly the seams the world had decided didn't need reinforcing. I used to think the locket was the whole story, the twist, the trick, the thing that made an invisible intern dangerous enough to matter. I don't think that anymore. The locket bought me 5 minutes a day. Beatrice's 9 years of ledgers, Julian's 8 years of patient acquisition, Sylvia Caldwell's decade of unglamorous self-preservation, Mira's willingness to keep CCing me on things she had no reason to share, Jocelyn's slow, real correction, Lena's trust that a rule would actually be enforced the first time it mattered, none of that came from 5 stolen minutes. All of it came from people simply choosing, day after ordinary day, to be a little more honest and a little more careful than the world strictly required of them. The locket was never the leverage. It was just the smallest, sharpest tool in a toolbox that mostly, in the end, ran on patience. I still have the locket. I still get exactly 5 minutes once a day, and there are entire weeks now where I don't spend them on anything more consequential than making sure I catch the elevator before the doors close. Because it turns out that the actual, quiet triumph of everything Beatrice and I built wasn't the auction, or the board dinner, or even getting my father's name back onto the door of a company that bears it. It was simply this: a building full of people who no longer need a stranger with a borrowed name and a strange, tired kind of luck to notice when something unfair is happening to them, because I built the whole place, deliberately, brick by brick, so that fairness wouldn't have to depend on luck ever again. I didn't need the 5 minutes for that one either. Some things, once you've built them properly, simply hold on their own.